The next item of business is a Stage 1 debate on Motion 23682 in the name of Hamza Yousaf on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. Can I invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Hamza Yousaf to speak to and move the motion.
Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name, and I'm also pleased to open this afternoon's Stage 1 debate on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. I intend to respond to a number of issues raised during the scrutiny process in my speech, but first of all, I want to thank the members of the Justice Committee, the clerking team, and all of those who gave evidence on the bill, which has helped shape what I think is a very comprehensive and very helpful Stage 1 report. The vast overwhelming majority of recommendations in that report have of course been accepted or indeed welcomed by the Government. At the start of the Justice Committee's scrutiny, the members heard from Lord Brackadale. It was in 2018 that Lord Brackadale published his report on hate crime, which had been commissioned by the Scottish Government. In commissioning this report, the then Minister for Community Safety and now member of the Justice Committee, Annabel Ewing, explained that, and I quote her, racism, intolerance and prejudice of all kinds are a constant threat to our society. And while Scotland is an open and inclusive nation, we are not immune from that threat. This review will help ensure that we have the right legislative protections in place to tackle hate crime wherever and whenever it happens. I could not agree more with that sentiment. It is true now as it was when Annabel Ewing made it. I thank Lord Brackadale for his extensive report upon which this bill before Parliament is based. The Scottish Government took Lord Brackadale's set of recommendations and consulted on them in late 2018. Informed by the views offered, the bill was developed and introduced earlier this year. Presiding Officer, I don't think anyone disagrees with the need to address hateful behaviour. It's only by confronting such behaviour that we can collectively build the Scotland that I suspect we all want to see, where everyone can live free from hatred and free from prejudice. This bill, which was, as I say, and have articulated, several years in development through an independent review and then Scottish Government consultation, is designed to consolidate, modernise and reform hate crime law in Scotland. Presiding Officer, hate crime is not merely unpleasant words that offend people. Hatred has an insidious and corrosive impact and effect on society. We often talk about the societal impact. We're actually right, of course, to do so. But we should also not lose sight of the impact hate crime can have on the individual affected and their family. I know this from personal experience, but so do many other victims, whether they have been the targets of hate because of their sexuality, because of their race, because of their religion, because of their transgender identity, or indeed any other characteristics, disability, and so on and so forth. Of course I will.
Joanne Lamont.
Secretary agree that very significant numbers of women are targeted precisely because they're women?
Yes, I'm certain that's the case, and I'll come to a paragraph or a section later on in my opening remarks on the misogynistic harassment working group, which will look at this issue in greater detail. And the committee, of course, took a great deal of evidence on this subject. Let me also make it clear, Presiding Officer, and I think it's really important to highlight this and acknowledge this, that of course I know members from across the Chamber have expressed concerns about elements of the bill. I hope I've demonstrated a conciliatory approach I wish to take as this bill progresses through the parliamentary process. The Government has shown great willingness to compromise and address those concerns, and I'm certain members will show the same willingness so that at the end of this process we have a bill that the entire Parliament can be proud of. Let me also just reiterate, although I'm sure it's known by everybody, that although members may still have concerns about aspects of the bill, firstly, I don't doubt their commitment to tackle hatred, and secondly, I will continue to have an open mind on amendments proposed as we move into stage 2 of the parliamentary process. Presiding Officer, moving on to the report in greater detail, a range of areas have aired during committee scrutiny. I want to touch on some of these. These issues include the distinct approach taken on race, finding the appropriate balance in protecting freedom of expression and protecting groups targeted by hateful behaviours and speech, the importance of the working group on misogynistic harassment, which Joanne Lamont has just referenced. The bill takes a distinctive approach in respect of race compared to other characteristics. This was, I would say, subject to considerable debate and discussion through stage 1. That's a sign of a healthy and robust scrutiny process. This distinct approach means in the area of stirring up hatred, the offences for race carry different legal thresholds than those for the other characteristics, a situation that is, of course, replicated throughout the UK, or across the UK. 2/3 of all recorded hate crime in Scotland related to race. In 2019-20, there were over 3,000 charges related to racial hate crime. That's 8 times a day. Every day, someone is targeted because of their race. And these, of course, are only the cases we know about. They are only the cases that have been recorded. Sadly, there's no denying the prevalence of racial hate crime offending in Scotland. So I believe a distinct approach for race is needed and justified, as it recognises the seriousness of racial hate crime, as well as the impact it has on community and societal cohesion. The removal of the word insulting, or repealing the existing standalone offence of racially aggravated harassment, could be particularly damaging in terms of tackling racial hatred within Scotland if such a removal could be perceived as a weakening of criminal law protection in the area of race. If we remove the term insulting, we would be the only legal jurisdiction in the UK to have done so. And the committee, I think, heard compelling testimony from those equality groups who supported the retention of that. I'm also aware, of course, that committee have asked during scrutiny whether the existing offence of racially aggravated harassment, also known as the Section 50A offence, could be consolidated into the bill. I'm pleased to confirm the Scottish Government does intend to do this by way of Stage 2 amendment. Presiding Officer, the stirring up hatred offences in the bill have prompted the greatest interest throughout scrutiny. As I said I would do, I've listened to the voices that had expressed concerns in this area and announced in September fundamental changes to the operation of the new stirring up hatred offences in the bill. By announcing these changes ahead of Stage 1 scrutiny getting underway, I'm pleased that this has allowed the Justice Committee to focus on many important aspects of the bill. The changes I announced, which have been welcomed by almost all stakeholders, reflected the degree of concern about the potential for the new stirring up of hatred offences to lead to people self-censoring, entirely legitimate activity. This was because if the offences do not require intent to stir up hatred, there could be, again, at the very least, a perception that those offences might be used to prosecute legitimate acts of expression, which then again might lead to an element of self-censorship. It was never the intention of this bill, or indeed of the new stirring up offences, to have this effect. So I hope by proposing to make this change, it's allowed us to focus more on the corrosive effects of hate speech. As the committee heard, hate speech can leave entire communities feeling isolated, scared and vulnerable to attack. And while there may be, and I accept this point, relatively small numbers of prosecutions under the new offences, as there have been under the existing provisions of race, stirring up hatred against a group of people is abhorrent, and the law must have the tools to address it when and where it occurs. So I'm pleased that that shift in policy that I announced, as I say, has greatly seemed to ease the fears of a number of stakeholders. Presiding Officer, a number of other issues relating to the operation of the stirring up of hatred offences have been debated during scrutiny. I announced at the Justice Committee last month that I would be proposing to remove from the bill specific provisions relating to theatrical performances. Some artistic stakeholders felt these provisions singled them out, and while they were based on existing precedent contained in the Public Order Act in 1986, I can consider they can be removed without significantly affecting the operation of the bill. I've also confirmed in my Stage 1 report response that I will be adding a time limit to police powers of search and entry in the bill, which again was a recommendation of the committee. Let me turn to freedom of expression. I know it's an issue that has been of some concern to members, but I also know it has been frustrating that some people have viewed that freedom of expression and hate crime law to be a binary choice, one or the other. That is not the view that this government takes. I know it's not a view that a number of stakeholders take. Freedom of expression is not an absolute right. There's never been an absolute right. I think most members probably accept that. But equally, it is important for the government to recognise, and I give an assurance we do recognise, that it is a fundamental freedom that is so important to our democracy and indeed to our rule of law. But just 1 second, Liam. This point. What I would say to all members is that it does not have to be a binary choice between freedom of expression, which we all value, and ensuring that we have strong hate crime laws that afford protection to people who are most often the targets of hate. It is not one or the other, but I'm happy to give way to Liam Kerr.
Liam Kerr.
It's just on that explicit point, actually. I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree, though, that hate crime can be tackled without actually violating the fundamental right freedom of expression?
Cabinet
I absolutely agree. This is my entire point, that the two do not have to be mutually exclusive. And I will come on to freedom of expression just now, actually. He'll know that we have within the bill freedom of expression clauses in relation to religion, and I have given feedback to the committee on how I think that can be expanded to align better with the freedom of expression clauses for religion in the English and Welsh legislation. I will, of course, also be quite keen to hear from the committee about what more we possibly can do. For the other characteristics in the bill, I will continue to reflect on whether there's a compelling need to either extend or strengthen the protections offered by freedom of expression. I'm not persuaded that all characteristics necessarily need a freedom of expression provision. Disability, for example, I'd be curious to see if anybody thinks there has to be a freedom of expression clause in relation to people with a disability. But I can see there's merit in seeking to both introduce freedom of expression provisions to some of the other characteristics in the bill, and indeed assess the depth of what such provisions should be. And in my stage one response, I did mention that I did think there was merit in bringing forward freedom of expression clauses on at least a couple of other protected characteristics, transgender identity and age as well. Presiding Officer, the process of scrutiny of this bill, and in particular the stirring up hatred offences, has helped improve the quality of the bill. There has been effective, constructive parliamentary scrutiny, just how there should be. Turning to, finally, the issue Joanne Lamont intervened on the characteristic of sex and how that is dealt with in the bill. I note that for good reason there are a range of very strong views on this matter, and let me reiterate again, I don't doubt for a second that regardless of which side of the debate you're on in relation to this, you believe very strongly in making sure that we have a bill that affords protection against hatred. There is a pressing need, undoubtedly, to tackle misogyny and gender-based violence in Scotland. Through our work to implement the Equally Safe strategy and take forward recommendations from the First Minister's National Advisory Council on Women and Girls, we understand the significance of how this type of behaviour can limit women and girls' space for action, and we want to address that. So I was therefore delighted to announce Baroness Helena Kennedy as the chair of the working group that will look to explore options around a potential standalone offence. Baroness Kennedy is well placed to take forward this work within the context of equality and human rights. Baroness Kennedy has indicated that Scotland is taking a pioneering position in exploring how the law can be harnessed to address this conduct directly aimed towards women. I'm happy to give way to Joanne Lamont.
Joanne Lamont.
First of all, I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary would recognise that hatred of women, as expressed through the centuries, is nothing new. I spoke in a debate in this Parliament last Thursday and was accused afterwards of transphobic hate, which was not true. If I were to respond by saying the people who accused me of transphobic hate were expressing themselves as a hatred of women and the rights I sought for women, I would have no defence against that, no protection from this legislation. Is that fair?
No, I don't think you're interpreting the legislation correctly at all, because it is not the subjective opinion of somebody in relation to the new offences that affect transgender identity, for example. It would not be enough for somebody to say, I think Joanne Lamont was transphobic and therefore I think she should be investigated and prosecuted. There is a high threshold. It would have to be proven. It would have to be proven beyond reasonable doubt. And given all the contextual factors included, that Joanne Lamont intended to stir up hatred against people because of their transgender identity, I'm certain that would not be able to be proven to be the case. And of course, on top of that, even if it was proven that your behaviour was intended to stir up hatred, you'd also have to meet the other legal threshold, which is that your behaviour would have to be threatening or abusive. Again, not a subjective test, and no doubt this will be covered in the debate in the bill, but an objective test by the court. So I don't agree with Joanne Lamont's interpretation of that. I understand I'm running out of time, so perhaps I will cover more in terms of the misogynistic working group in my closing remarks, if I may, and just simply end, Presiding Officer, by saying that I know colleagues will wish to speak on many other areas of the bill that I haven't had time to cover. I'm certain we'll go into issues around the dwelling defence, public element, abusive and the definition of that, the reasonableness defence, etc., etc. So I will listen very, very carefully to what parliamentarians have to say. But can I again thank the Justice Committee for what I think is a comprehensive and excellent report. It gives us a good basis going into stage 2. So my plea would be to work together, as we have done in advance of this stage, to strengthen the law to tackle hate crime in a way that protects the rights of everyone to live their lives free from harm and while protecting those important fundamental rights to the freedom of expression. I'm certain we can do that. And, Presiding Officer, I commend the general principles of the bill to the Parliament, and again I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. I now call Adam Tompkins to open on behalf of the Justice Committee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Our law reports are replete with resounding statements of the importance of free speech. Lord Steyn in the Sims case said, "Freedom of speech is the lifeblood of democracy. The free flow of information and ideas informs political debate. It's a safety valve. People are more likely to accept decisions that go against them if they can, in principle, seek to influence them." Lord Bingham in the Animal Defenders International case said, "Freedom of thought and expression is an essential condition of an intellectually healthy society. The free communication of information, opinions and argument about the law which a state should enact and the policies its government at all levels should pursue is an essential condition of truly democratic government." In Western liberal democracies, either one of two approaches is taken to the problem of hate speech, that's to say, expression that is directed to stirring up hatred. Most countries, including the United Kingdom, seek to regulate it, criminalising its worst excesses, whilst at the same time bearing in mind the cardinal importance of free speech as set out in the quotes I've just cited. The outlier is the United States, where the First Amendment prohibits such regulation with constitutional protection of speech that goes further than anywhere else. US critics of European or Canadian or New Zealand hate speech laws say that they suffer from two flaws, both fatal from First Amendment perspectives. That's to say that they are vague and that they are overbroad. Presiding Officer, for the last 2 months, the Justice Committee, which I convene, has been poring over every line of the hate crime bill, anxious to ensure that it falls into neither of these traps, that it is neither vague nor overbroad. And the bill, as our unanimously agreed report makes clear, is part consolidation and part expansion. Some provisions are based on already existing offences found in the Public Order Act, but others extend the reach of Scotland's criminal law. Presiding Officer, there is no disagreement between the Committee and the Cabinet Secretary about how such provisions should be understood. We all accept that we have no right to criminalise speech just because we find it offensive. Indeed, we have no right to criminalise speech no matter how offensive we find it. Freedom of expression is not absolute in our law, but at the same time, there is absolutely no doubt that it extends to the right to offend, shock, or disturb. Freedom only to speak inoffensively is not worth having, as one judge put it. So this bill is about matters of fundamental importance, but it's also about balance. Which of us would want to live in a Scotland where people are free to threaten each other, to abuse each other on the basis of their race, their religion, or any aspect of their sexual identity? Getting that balance right is not easy. It's not a question of science, but a matter of judgment. And in the committee's judgment, this bill does not get that balance right, which is why, again, unanimously, we have recommended a whole series of amendments. But most, but not quite all of our amendments have now been accepted by the Cabinet Secretary, and I thank him for his thoughtful and considered response to our report, which was published yesterday. In our report, Presiding Officer, we welcomed the amendments announced earlier in the autumn, but we say they do not go far enough. The Cabinet Secretary said in September that the new offences of stirring up hatred on grounds other than race should be amended so that they can be committed only where such hatred is intended to be stirred up, not merely where it is likely. In the committee's view, this was a useful and helpful first step. The Cabinet Secretary returned to the committee in November to say that in addition he would remove from the bill the provision it contains targeted at theatres and public performance of plays, and that he would strengthen the way in which the bill protects free speech as regards religion. It's not just discussion or criticism of religion which should be protected, but ridicule, expressions of antipathy, even insult too. Again, the committee welcomed all of this. And let me say, Presiding Officer, that the Cabinet Secretary's constructive and pragmatic approach to this bill has been much appreciated by everybody on the Justice Committee and has greatly helped to improve the scrutiny that we have given to the bill. That scrutiny has led us to conclude that, welcome as the Cabinet Secretary's amendments are, we do need to go further to ensure that the bill achieves its objectives without interfering with our fundamental rights. So, for example, it's not just free speech with regard to religion that needs further protection, it's free speech with regard to other characteristics too. Police powers to enter and search premises need to be more tightly defined in the bill, and further thought needs to be given to the extent to which we want to criminalise behaviour that takes place wholly in private, but which nonetheless is caught by the stirring up offences. And on this point, I would just remind Parliament that the full title of this bill is the Hate Crime and Public Order Bill. Current stirring up offences, as I've already said, are found in the Public Order Act. And we should bear in mind, I think, that these offences are targeted at public disorder, not at private thought. Among this suite of further amendments that we recommend, one, to my mind, stands out. Under the bill, it will be an offence to use threatening or abusive behaviour intended to stir up hatred. We must define what we mean. In particular, we must explain what we mean by abusive. This key term must have an objective meaning, such that, in our view, the Crown must show, in order to secure a conviction, that a reasonable person would have found the behaviour to be abusive. Now, the Cabinet Secretary, in his response, has indicated his strong agreement with this sentiment, and I very much welcome that, but he seems to think that the bill does not need to be amended to reflect it. So this is a matter which we are clearly going to have to come back to later on. I want to illustrate what is at stake here with a real example which touches directly on the questions that Joanne Lamont has already raised this afternoon. This is a delicate matter that needs to be treated with care and sensitivity. But as we all know, Presiding Officer, there is at the moment in Scotland a live, robust and sometimes rather fraught debate about women's rights, about whether sex is immutable, and about the rights of transgender people. Some women campaigning for a certain view on these matters have been accused of transphobia. Presiding Officer, the committee is absolutely clear that the bill is not intended to chill public debate on these matters or to lead to any self-censorship in relation to them. But the committee has been anxious to ensure that these are not the unintended consequences of the bill. And that, Presiding Officer, is why we need to ensure that someone can be charged with a stirring up offence only if a reasonable person would have regarded their behaviour as abusive. Tim Hopkins of the Equality Network and Becky Kaufman of the Scottish Trans Alliance gave compelling evidence on this point. Becky Kaufman said that aspects of the debate on women's rights can make people, and indeed has made her, extremely uncomfortable and can be very disrespectful of people's identities, but that nonetheless, this is no business of the criminal law. And this brings me full circle. Let me just finish the point, Cabinet Secretary, and happily I'll give way. This brings me full circle. This bill is not about criminalising that which other people find offensive or disrespectful. It's about behaviour, including speech, that threatens, that abuses, and that does so intending to stir up hatred. Happy to give way to the Cabinet Secretary.
Hamza Youssef.
I thank the convener for a very thoughtful speech and also for giving way. I accept what he says, and I will go back and reflect further about whether or not we can give a definition of abusive on the face of the bill, not just in explanatory notes, but on the face of the bill. So I commit to doing that. But does the member accept, the convener accept, that even if there is a discussion or debate around the definition of abusive, that the second part of the legal test is crucially important, that beyond reasonable doubt, it has to be proven, in his example, that somebody was intended to stir up hatred against somebody because of their transgender identity?
Adam Tompkins.
Absolutely, I accept that. But the committee received a pile of evidence that it's not just about what happens in the criminal courts that we need to think about, it's what happens in terms of police investigations. And what I think, well, I speak for myself, what I am concerned about is that we don't have unnecessary police investigations on the basis of flimsy allegations that somebody has engaged in, for example, transphobia, when no reasonable person would have arrived at that conclusion. That's the force of my concerns here. Presiding Officer, I'm nearing the end of my remarks, and I've focused so far on only one aspect of this bill, namely the stirring up offences. And while this is, of course, the most contentious aspect of the bill, it's other parts of the bill that will have by far the greater practical effect. On this, we're all agreed. Offences aggravated by prejudice harm not only the immediate victim, but communities at large. As such, they should attract an aggravated sentence. And the committee agrees with the Cabinet Secretary that judges should be transparent about this in their sentencing decisions. Hate crimes are better understood as focusing on the particular vice of prejudice rather than on broader considerations of vulnerability, but it should be for Parliament in legislation and not for ministers in regulations to determine what the hate crime characteristics are. This bill does not include sex as a hate crime characteristic, and sharply contrasting views about that were presented to the committee in evidence. On balance, we think it prudent to await the conclusions of the newly established Working Group on Misogynistic Harassment before legislating on this area, and we very warmly welcome the appointment of Helena Kennedy to chair that working group. Presiding Officer, there's a lot more to be said, but the clock is against me, and I hope I've given a flavour of the committee's work on this bill. Our report is lengthy and detailed, and I make no apology for either. The 390 paragraphs of our report were designed with one objective in sight: to shine light on this bill, its strengths and its limitations, rather than to generate yet more heat about what has been a very contested measure. We could not have done that without the open and fair-mindedness which each and every member of the committee brought to this inquiry. We could not have done it without the extraordinary dedication, high standards and professionalism of the committee's brilliant clerking team led by Stephen Imrie and Katrina Venters, and most of all, Presiding Officer, we could not have done it without the help and support of the hundreds of Scots who engaged in the lawmaking process and who gave evidence, and I thank them all. Thank you.
I now call Liam Kerr for up to 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to open for the Scottish Conservatives in this debate on whether or not Parliament should agree to the principles of the Hate Crime and Public Order Bill. Before addressing the principles, I actually want to pick up on the closing remarks there of the convener. This is the most controversial bill in the history of Scottish Parliament. There were an unprecedented 2,000 plus people and groups who felt compelled to respond to the request for evidence. That is extraordinary, and I think shows the best of civic Scotland. But it also shows just how badly the Scottish Government has got this bill wrong when it laid it. But then, thereafter, the Justice Committee took evidence from witnesses who presented themselves to scrutiny in very difficult circumstances, pursuant to a very challenging time frame. And every witness added considerable value to this inquiry. And that is reflected, I think, in the quality of the committee's report. And that report is a tribute to the professionalism, the skill and the patience of the clerks to the committee and the parliamentary staff. And I know I speak for everyone here when I acknowledge them. And finally, I must acknowledge the MSPs on the committee. I approached this inquiry with a significant degree of trepidation. In September, I called a debate asking Parliament to reject this draft bill and come back with something workable that didn't attack freedom of speech, something which could be scrutinised and implemented in the short time available to protect, via the aggravators, those we are all so keen to protect. And that proposition was rejected by all parties bar the Conservatives, and so I worried about how the inquiry would go. However, the committee was collegiate, it was courteous, but it was also forensic. And both in its evidence-taking and the report showed, I think, the best of what parliamentary scrutiny should be. And that committee came to a unanimous conclusion that only if the changes unanimously demanded in the report were made to the bill should Parliament then approve the principles of the bill. And so too those principles. The First Minister told us in the programme for government, we need to ensure that we have laws in this country that are capable of tackling hate crime because it is pernicious and horrible and we should have zero tolerance for it. And she is right. And there was widespread acceptance from witnesses that we must do all we can to ensure that the first part of this law, which deals with the statutory aggravations, is not only capable of tackling hate crime, but does so completely and unambiguously. Few witnesses had any issue with the principles of Part 1. Similarly, I don't think anyone had issue with the principles of Part 4, the abolition of the offence of blasphemy. Part 3, dealing with provisions around characteristics, was similarly accepted in the principle, although properly there require to be further debates and amendments on this point. It is with Part 2 that severe challenges arose. As introduced, the hate crime bill poses a grave threat to freedom of speech. As drafted, it would outlaw speech even if it was plain that the speaker had no intention to express, never mind stir up, hatred. The offence could be committed even in your own home. We would literally have to watch what we said around our own dinner table. As drafted, those taking a particular position on women's rights risked being accused of transphobia and potentially criminised for hate crimes, just as Joanne Lamont raised earlier. And the committee heard time and again, whether by written submission or by oral evidence from individuals and organisations as diverse as the Law Society, the Faculty of Advocates, the Scottish Police Federation, the Scottish Newspaper Society, the Humanist Society and the Catholic Church, that the draft provisions threaten freedom of speech. And those are the challenges that I sought to resolve in September, when in response to the bill as drafted, I suggested the Scottish Government take this draft off the table and come back with something which did not have the controversial stirring up offences in it, in order that the aggravation of offences by prejudice, which we all agreed were so vital, could proceed smoothly and promptly. Now, Parliament was not with me on that proposition, but the Cabinet Secretary was with me that this extension of stirring up offences raises questions about impacts on freedom of expression and citizens' engagement in democratic debate. And I say that because in what I believe to be unprecedented moves, even before Parliament started debating this bill, before even the evidence-taking at committee began, the Justice Secretary announced he would be making amendments to his own bill. The new stirring up offences, he said, would be amended at stage 2, so they are crimes of intention only. That was welcome, but insufficient. And we knew it was insufficient because the pressure from Civic Scotland did not relent. And so the Justice Secretary returned to the Justice Committee to acknowledge the fundamental flaws inherent in the Part 2 principles and promised to bring forward an amendment at stage 2 that provisions on theatres, plays and live performances would be scrapped. But even so, the cross-party Justice Committee was unanimous. That would still not right the wrongs of this bill, and further changes, those set out in the committee's report, must be made. And only if the Justice Secretary implemented the unanimously agreed recommendations of the All-Party Justice Committee would this bill be acceptable. Now, yesterday, we received the Government's response to the committee's report, and there are encouraging amendments being proposed. The removal of Section 5 on the possession of inflammatory material, a proposal for time limits for police powers of entry per Section 6, freedom of expression protections are being strengthened. So we've got a third section of changes, a third set of changes being proposed by the government to its own bill's principles before we've even arrived at stage 2. But, Presiding Officer, here's the rub. Firstly, not all the committee's recommendations have been taken on board regarding the stage 2 principles. The reasonableness defence is not being added to. There's just a consideration of adding to the explanatory notes. The term abusive, which we heard so much about from the convener, is not going to be defined, but rather clarified in the explanatory notes. And a note from the Law Society's submission that came in last night, they say simply clarifying in the explanatory notes is unacceptable. The bill must stand on its own, so there is no role for guidance to accompany the legislation. There is still no protection in the bill for things said in the privacy of your own home. Not only a violation of the right to privacy, but to paraphrase the convener, a public order offence committed in private. Yes.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. Would you accept that there are other aspects of the criminal law that do impact what happens inside one's home?
Liam Kerr.
Yes, I would. And we heard about that in committee. I think my point still stands. We don't have protection in this bill for things said in the privacy of one's own home. But other crucial problems remain unchanged, such as the Section 3 stirring up of hatred offences. The threshold for criminality in these provisions is arguably low, and they're still wider ranging than other jurisdictions in the UK. The freedom of expression protections won't cover all new characteristics, and even for the characteristics that are covered, these protections are arguably not sufficient. So the conditions imposed for support by the Justice Committee are not satisfied. And of course, we do not know today that his promised amendments will be passed at stage 2, because he can propose all he likes. It is for Parliament to approve or not approve. Today, we vote on the principles of this bill as drafted. Now, in the convener's opening remarks, he said, this bill is about matters of fundamental importance, but it is also about balance. In the committee's judgment, this bill does not get that balance right. He is correct. The committee is correct. The bill, on whose unamended principles we vote today, does not get the balance right and, as drafted, could criminalise that which other people find offensive or disrespectful. And I find support from that proposition.
Yes, I can. If it's a quick one, please.
Yes, just thus far, Liam Kerr hasn't really mentioned the victims of hate crime. So what does he say to the Equality Network, Stonewall, racial equality organisations, Muslim Council of Scotland, Scottish Council of Jewish Communities, Victim Support Scotland, Aid Scotland, all of those who support the general principles of the bill?
Liam Kerr.
I thank them very much for their counsel in the committee sections, and also remind the Cabinet Secretary, I'm sure this wasn't the point he was making, but he will have read the Murray Blackburn Mackenzie submission that came in last night, and they said, anticipating the concern that careful scrutiny of legislation does not mean lack of compassion for the groups it sets out to help. Effective legislation requires critical engagement. And I know the Cabinet Secretary agrees with me that that is what we're engaged in here. And the groups that he mentions, I'm very grateful to them. I think their evidence was extremely important. And they will appreciate that that's what we're doing too. I find support for the proposition, Presiding Officer. I was talking about the bill on whose unamended principles we vote today doesn't get the balance right. And I had support from that from the LGB Alliance, whose submission last night included the words, "We have serious concerns about the bill in its present form and ask it be withdrawn and rethought." This bill is the most controversial in the history of devolution, but the Cabinet Secretary's response has not reflected the avalanche of opposition his bill has faced. Genuine hate crime must always be punished, but this law goes too far. Our fundamental right to freedom of speech remains under threat, and accordingly, the Scottish Conservatives will vote against the principles of this bill at decision time tonight.
Call Rhoda Grant, please, for up to 8 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I would like to start by echoing some of the comments Liam Kerr made about the committee and the drafting of the committee report. And I'd like to pay tribute to those, the clerks, the committee members, and indeed all those who give evidence to the committee, including my colleague James Kelly, who was on the committee taking evidence. I joined the committee just as the report was being drafted, and I expected, if I'm being very frank, to join a bit of a rammy. But it was not the case, and that's down to everybody who works with and in the committee. All worked hard to ensure the committee could reach consensus, and I believe by doing so, and if the Cabinet Secretary continues to work with us, we can bring forward good legislation that will stand the test of time. But there are many complex points of law to be considered, but paramount is the balance between freedom of speech and the protection from hate speech. Scottish Labour is supportive of the overall principles of the hate crime bill and agree that it is important to consolidate hate crime legislation. However, we have real concerns about the way the bill has been drafted, and it's welcome that the Cabinet Secretary has now, on several occasions, listened to concerns, and I hope he will continue to do that. While the changes he accepted are welcome, I believe he must go further to meet the concerns expressed about this bill. There are concerns about whether or not to add sex as a characteristic in the bill. There is a real concern about leaving it out, and that might give the signal that hate crime on the basis of sex and misogyny is in some way of lesser importance than other hate crimes. There are also concerns that the promised legislation to deal with misogyny may never transpire. In Scotland, we know that violence against women is not only about hatred, it's about control and it's about inequality. And Gender pointed out that the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention to Combat Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence both suggest a presumption against gender-neutral laws that protect men and women in exactly the same way, because they seldom protect women as men and women are not equally empowered. This is a concern expressed by Engender Zero Tolerance, Scottish Women's Aid and Rape Crisis Scotland, who oppose a sex aggravator and support separate legislation that incorporates the societal issues that underpin misogyny and violence against women. Scottish Labour welcome the working group on misogyny and harassment and agree that given the serious nature of violence against women, it's right that provisions and protections must reflect that. However, we share concerns about the delay and reserve our position regarding adding sex as an aggravator in order to avoid a hierarchy of protections. We therefore agree with the committee that the working group should report within a year to allow timely interpretation of their recommendations, and will also reflect on what may be required between then and the finalising of the bill.
Liam Kerr.
I'm very grateful. It's just a very quick one. The member knows that I share a lot of her concerns on this, and I wonder where Scottish Labour are at the moment in terms of bringing forward that amendment at stage 2 to introduce sex as an aggravator.
Rhoda Grant.
We're obviously considering that as part of what we may do at stage 2. I'm not saying we're actually doing it, but we're looking at that, and we'll look at the balance of evidence when we speak to stakeholders, because there is an issue about having protection in place while we wait for a working group to report, and it may be that the bill could be amended to allow that to happen, so that there is no gap between one protection and another coming into place. But as I say, we will be discussing that with stakeholders, so have not drafted anything at this point. It's welcome that the Scottish Government has conceded that amendments are necessary to make Part 2 of the bill fit for purpose, and we've heard a fair amount about that already. Requiring intent for stirring up offences will be an improvement to the provisions, and this would ensure that the bill includes adequate protections for freedom of speech and thought, and it does not criminalise legitimate views. The Cabinet Secretary proposed a triple lock, and that's welcome. That behaviour must be threatening or abusive and intended to be so. And as with all criminal law, the crime must be proven beyond all reasonable doubt, and the perpetrator must intend wrongdoing. I believe these amendments are welcome, but Ephraim Brozinski of the Scottish Jewish Council communities still had concerns regarding hate speech online, and he told the committee, having posted their hatred, people will then end their comments with just saying or just asking, and they are being given a get-out-of-jail-free card because they say that they did not intend to cause offence, but they were just merely asking a question. And I would welcome clarification from the Cabinet Secretary that says any easy defence will not be possible under the Act. Perhaps in that sense, it's disappointing that he has chosen not to clarify the operation of the reasonableness defence in the bill as recommended by the committee, as it could have provided the reassurance in that scenario, and I hope he will look at that again.
Hamza Yousaf.
Can I thank Rhoda Grant for giving way, and I'll address her point about an easy defence in my closing. Just on the reasonableness defence, what I really struggle with, and I'm happy for any member to come back to me during their intervention, contributions on this, is that I struggle to understand a behaviour that would be threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred, but it could still be justified as reasonable. And I don't know if Rhoda Grant has an example of that kind of behaviour, where the intention was to stir up hatred, but it was reasonable because of X, Y, Z defence. And if she does, I'd be really keen to hear it.
Rhoda Grant.
I don't have an example of that, but I think law needs to take into account every possible scenario. I think we have to be very careful, especially when we're dealing with people's freedom of speech, that we don't do anything that impinges on that. And as we've seen, especially when we look at things like social media, where some of the language and some of the behaviour towards people is pretty grim. So I think we need to look at what I might think of as reasonable and somebody else might think of as reasonable is maybe not the same thing. So hopefully we will hear from the Cabinet Secretary whether he can amend further to provide that comfort. Presiding officer, if I can turn to freedom of expression. Tim Hopkins from the Equality Network talked about the approach of the Law Commission for England and Wales, which is similar to sections 11 and 12 of the bill, and he told the committee that they clarify the law applies to hatred against persons, not against institutions or belief systems, that criticisms of behaviour is permitted and provide for a space for discussion of public policy on potentially controversial issues. The argument was made by some of Article that this was in line with Article 10 of the Human Rights Act, and that provided those protections. However, the article does state that the exercise of these freedoms may be subject to such formalities, conditions and restrictions or penalties as are prescribed by law and are necessary to democratic society. And therefore, it would be better that the law incorporates the protections expressly rather than depends on Article 10 of the Human Rights Act. And I know the Cabinet Secretary has shown willing to improve freedom of expression provisions in the bill, and Scottish Labour believe he should set out how he further intends to amend this area ahead of stage 2. Presiding officer, I am running out of time, and I maybe make further comments in my closing speech.
Thank you, Ms Grant. We'll move on now to John Finney, please, for up to 6 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed. Presiding officer, this bill has taken a rather unusual route thus far, and it's certainly prompted a lot of debate. I would like to thank, as my colleagues in the Justice Committee have, those who have helped us to getting to this point, the witnesses, our outstanding parliamentary staff, and self-praise is faint praise, but colleagues did work very collaboratively to produce the report that we did that we're now discussing. So one thing that became very apparent was that words and phrases are important, whether that's stirring up, likely to, insulting, abusive, dwelling, reasonableness, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, which we know isn't an absolute right. And the Justice Committee explored how far the right to freedom of speech extends, particularly as to whether the right extends to the right to offend. And this is, follows on from us dealing with the defamation bill, where there was a similar issue, freedom of expression versus the right to defend your reputation. And similar concerns voiced about the potential for a chilling effect legislation could have. Now, in written evidence, the Law Society cited with approval Lord Justice Sedley, quote, that freedom only to speak inoffensively is not worth having. Likewise, the Faculty of Advocates, they cited Lord Rogers, who said that freedom of speech applies to information ideas that offend, shock and disturb. I think words have become very important in the weight that is attached to them. What the committee agreed, and it's in paragraph 44, is that the right to freedom of speech includes the right to offend, shock and disturb. And whilst we understand the bill is not intended to prohibit speech which many may find offensive, or indeed intending to lead to self-censorship, we were conscious and anxious to ensure there was no unintended consequences in the bill. There's no single definition of hate crime, and Lord Bracadale used the following definition: offences which adhere to the principle crime motivated by hatred and prejudice towards features of the victim's identity should be treated differently from ordinary crimes. And we know that the existing arrangements for hate crime legislation to deal with an aggravator to an existing offence, whether that's robbery, assault, breach of the peace, and that a lesser degree of proof is required to prove that aggravation. Now, what the consultation on this bill did was generate a lot of interest. A substantial portion of the responses we got expressed concerns about freedom of speech and religious expression. But that, of course, has to be countered against the need for protection of vulnerable groups and, quote, sending out the message about the unacceptability of prejudice-based content. So that was that constant tension throughout: freedom of speech, freedom to offend, and the state's obligation to ensure that doesn't tip over into hate. And that cued some lobbying with some very intemperate language for some people and some very emotive imagery about constabularies raiding churches. And that has to be set against the concerns there have been about the bill attacking existing protections if there was to be further dilution. The Cabinet Secretary's approach is to be commended, as others have said. I think the letters in September and the indication in October about changes, excluding the likelihood aspect, is very welcome, and I think a signal of I hope, the way will continue, because thanking for the response yesterday, it will still seem there's a way to go with some aspects from colleagues. There's an important signal comes from this legislation and the way it's been addressed. It is a very emotive subject, and we all want to see it being properly addressed. Now, as regards the issue of insulting, the Cabinet Secretary defended it. It's been in legislation for 34 years. And the debate saw that the Law Society said that it lowers the bar of criminality too far. And the issue of a hierarchy of discrimination has been mentioned, an inconsistency in relation to race. However, I think the committee rightly agreed that there are unique features. The pernicious nature of race crime, and race organisations strongly argued in favour of retaining the issue of the question of insulting, with perceptions that it would undermine. One submission from Amy Allard-Dunbar of Intercultural Youth Scotland said, microaggressions are daily instances of racism that add up to cause significant racial trauma. A lot of them come under the term insulting, and it would be hard to understand their impact if the term was not included in the bill. That provision needs to be kept. There's been a lot of discussion. There's been discussion about abusive. There's been a discussion that the Crown Office tell us that's a concept well understood by Scots prosecutors. There are people who are in favour of the decision. I think there's discussions to continue with that. Regarding the dwelling defence, similarly, I don't think we're done with that yet. The question of public performances, well, very welcome the proposal from the Cabinet to remove that. Likewise, the time limit in police powers. The misogynistic working group, polarised views there, and I do feel there's a gap. I'm delighted that Dame Helena is to carry out an investigation into that. Victim support, very briefly, I'll conclude, Presiding Officer said, hate crime is frequently more devastating and longer lasting than any other types of crime because an aspect of an individual's core identity and sense of belonging is attacked. In its view, abusive behaviour forms part of a number of microaggressions that can not only negatively impact individual victims, but the whole community and marginalised groups. For that reason, we need to keep discussion. But at decision time, the Scottish Party will be voting for the general bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Finney. Liam Kerr, please, for up to 6 minutes. Sorry, Liam MacArthur even.
You're not the first, you won't be the last, Deputy Presiding Officer. In normal times, this would be a complex and sensitive bill with potentially far-reaching consequences during a pandemic, with evidence being taken virtually and under enormous time pressures. The task of scrutiny has been made immeasurably harder. So, like others, I pay tribute to all of those who have played their part, to witnesses who literally responded in their thousands, but who also adjusted their oral evidence to take account of the shifting sands of the government's position, to committee colleagues, not least our convener, who have been diligent, forensic, as well as collaborative throughout, and our clerks and Spice, who've provided exceptional support. But thanks also to the Cabinet Secretary, who recognised the hole he had dug for himself and sought a ladder rather than a shovel. He's not out of the hole yet, but he's a good deal closer than he was when we last debated this bill back in September. In that debate, the Justice Secretary accepted the ladder I offered him by acknowledging the serious concerns around Part 2 of the bill, the so-called stirring up offences, and agreeing to set out ahead of Stage 1 evidence-taking how he proposed to address them. This resulted in these offences being made intent only. It was a small but significant shift. It left a great deal still to be reviewed, repaired and removed, but allowed the committee to begin hearing evidence in a very different atmosphere, with a bill that was salvageable as opposed to one in need of being put out of its misery. And we shouldn't underestimate how problematic that latter outcome would have been. Our hate crime laws need modernising and consolidating. Hate crime for all protected characteristics is on the rise, and while the culture shift required to reverse this ugly tide will take time. Our police, prosecutors and courts need the tools to deal with it when and where it occurs. At the same time, of course, we must be alert to the impact on other fundamental freedoms. Our report asks the question whether rights such as freedom of speech and privacy should be interpreted and applied generously, and restrictions to those rights legislated for narrowly and only where necessary in the public interest. To that question, as a Liberal, I believe the answer is yes, even if those freedoms are not unfettered. And again, I quote Lord Justice Sedley, who's been anonymously cited by others, who argued that free speech includes not only the inoffensive, but the irritating, the contentious, the eccentric, the heretical, the unwelcome, and the provocative. Freedom only to speak inoffensively is not worth having. It's why, during our Stage 1 evidence gathering, I focused my questioning on how those freedoms might be afforded greater protection within the context of this bill. It's where I intend to concentrate my energies during Stage 2. So I welcome the Justice Secretary's earlier commitment to enhancing protections in relation to religion. Welcome too his willingness to go further in broadening and deepening those protections relating to other characteristics. I look forward to seeing the detail of such amendments and remain happy to work with the Justice Secretary, as well as those who gave the committee evidence on these issues, in developing options for the committee to consider. And while it's important to stress that each characteristic is equally deserving of protection, as John Finney said, those protections need not be equal. As the committee recognised, history, nature and the prevalence of hate crime differs and justifies taking different approaches. In passing, as the convener, I think, very ably laid out, particular attention will be needed regarding protections in relation to transgender. As witnesses observed time and again, in an already combustible debate, there is a risk of making it even more explosive. But race clearly stands out, not least given its significantly higher prevalence. It's right, therefore, we do nothing that dilutes or appears to dilute the protections that currently exist. This makes the case for retaining both the current threshold for stirring up and reference to insulting. It's also why bringing the standalone offence of racially aggravated harassment within the scope of this bill is the right thing to do. Consolidation helps make law more accessible and thereby more effective. In the same way, updating the language to replace evincing with displaying malice or ill will addresses concerns we heard about accessibility. Deputy Presiding Officer, while most attention around this bill is focused on Part 2, Tim Hopkins of the Equality Network reminded us that Part 1 on aggravators is far more important. In England and Wales, where there is a stirring up offence covering race, religion and sexual orientation, the Law Commission found stirring up was very infrequently used compared to aggravated charges. This reinforces Lord Bracadale's conclusion that basing our hate crime laws on an aggravator model remains the right approach. At this stage, of course, sex is excluded as an aggravator, and while I very much understand the rationale for wanting to explore a standalone misogyny offence, it does leave a glaring omission within this bill. There's also a risk that any future provision will be brought forward under secondary legislation, inevitably limiting the scrutiny by Parliament, even under the super-affirmative procedure. Baroness Kennedy's appointment as chair of the working group is certainly a coup, and I can think of no better person to take on that role. If this delays by years any meaningful change to this area of the law, however, the impeccable qualifications of the person kicking the can down the road will come as cold comfort. Deputy Presiding Officer, as Bemis made clear and the latest hate crime statistics bear witness, Scotland is not immune from racism or prejudice. So we should be looking to ensure our laws are fit for purpose. At the same time, we must avoid doing anything that undermines our fundamental freedoms, which ultimately makes the task of tackling hate crime even more difficult. That's the challenge for the committee at Stage 2. The Cabinet Secretary has already undertaken major surgery to his bill, but more will be needed if this bill is to gain Parliament's approval. So with those caveats, however, Scottish Liberal Democrats will be voting in support of the principles of this bill this evening. Thank you.
Okay, we move now to the open debate, and can I say that all of the opening speeches went over time, so we have to be really strict here. 6 minutes for open speeches, and that must have any interventions included within it. Rona Mackay, followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to be speaking in the Stage 1 debate on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill, and I will be supporting the general principles today. As Deputy Convener of the Justice Committee, can I add my thanks to the clerking team and the Bill team for the fantastic support we received throughout the scrutiny of the Bill. It was a big job and they made it immeasurably easier. They enabled the committee to deal with its many aspects in a reasonable and consensual way. However, I'm sure the many victims of hate crime are even more disappointed than I am that the Conservatives are not backing the general principles. They must feel severely let down. Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice gave evidence twice, an absolute demonstration of his willingness to engage and listen to all concerns. He's accepted the overwhelming majority of the committee's recommendations and is willing to engage further on other areas. But with all categories of hate crime rising, it's imperative that those spreading hate to minority groups are held to account. Presiding Officer, I'd like to start with the committee's first recommendation in the report. It is: the committee agrees that the right to freedom of speech includes the right to offend, shock or disturb. The committee understands that this bill is not intended to prohibit speech, which others may find offensive, and neither is it intended to lead to any self-censorship. The committee is anxious to ensure, however, that these are not the unintended consequences of the bill. I think that's a very good place to start. This bill has achieved huge media and public attention over fears that freedom of speech might be restrained. This is categorically not and never has been the intention of the bill. The intention is to show that Scotland does not endorse the freedom to abuse or threaten minorities. In 2018, a hate crime review was undertaken by Lord Brackadale with a view to consolidating various acts of hate crime, some of which have existed for decades, making existing fragmented legislation fit for the 21st century by putting it into one bill. Most of Lord Brackadale's recommendations are agreed to in the bill, and the consolidation has been overwhelmingly welcomed by the legal profession and stakeholders. Recommendations accepted by the Government include the strengthening of protection for freedom of expression provisions and ensuring the test of the term abusive in the bill is an objective test. On the abusive test, it should be noted that the existing law under Section 30 of the Criminal Justice and Licensing Scotland Act 2010 is widely used, and any clarification mustn't restrict the definition, in my view, relating to, for example, domestic abuse cases which could have damaging unintended consequences. For this reason, and I note the Cabinet Secretary said in his intervention to the convener, I believe the decision to put clarity in the explanatory notes is the correct one, rather than putting it on the face of the bill. Also accepted was bringing the existing offence of racially aggravated harassment into the bill and proposing new limits on police powers of search and entry. There was concern raised from some faith groups, artists, authors and others about Section 4, and this was removed entirely. Section 5 of the bill, which deals with the possession of inflammatory materials, will be removed by amendment at Stage 2. Presiding Officer, one of the most important amendments was made by the Cabinet Secretary even before our scrutiny started. That was, as we've heard, in relation to Part 1, stirring up of hatred. So the Cabinet Secretary introduced the requirement to show intent to stir up hatred, which had to be proved beyond reasonable doubt in a court of law. The amendment was universally welcomed by all stakeholders and witnesses during evidence sessions, and I believe it was the right thing to do. Presiding Officer, each member of the committee followed a specific line of questioning with witnesses. Mine was the different approach taken in the bill to racial hatred, that being to retain the word insulting in the stirring up element, which has been present in current legislation under the Public Order Act for 34 years. There was the difference in relation to racial hatred. I don't support that view. Racial hatred accounts for 2/3 of all. To remove the word insulting would, in my view, dilute the message that it is totally important.
Excuse me, Ms Mackay. When you move backwards from your screen, we'll lose your voice. So can you lean in, please?
Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Apologies, Presiding Officer. To remove the word insulting would dilute the message that it is abhorrent. It would also mean there's a lower threshold for race hatred in Scotland than England and Wales. Groups dealing with racial hatred, such as BEMIS, the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, and YouthLink Scotland, told us that they support the inclusion of this word. Having never been targeted in this way, unlike the Cabinet Secretary, their evidence is good enough for me. Presiding Officer, the so-called dwelling defence has been much debated, often fuelled by misinformation. I believe there should be no sanctuary for intent to stir up hatred in a home or other closed space. Other crimes that take place in the home do not have this defence. Any allegation of this nature would have to be proved beyond reasonable doubt, so this is not about restricting discussion around the kitchen table. Presiding Officer, misogyny in Scotland must be tackled, and I very much welcome the setting up of a misogyny working group to be headed by Dame Helena Kennedy QC. The group will consider whether the characteristic of sex ought to be added by regulation to the list of characteristics as an aggravator. However, leading women's organisations, including Engender and Scottish Women's Aid, articulated strong arguments against a sex aggravator being included. I'm pleased that the Cabinet Secretary said he intends to bring forward amendments to Stage 2 to add freedom of expression clauses for the protected characteristics of transgender identity and age. Presiding Officer, it would take more than 6 minutes to cover just one aspect of this bill. So in conclusion, I ask everyone who had preconceived notions or views about the bill to listen to the detail, to understand that it's not about curbing freedom of speech. We should all get behind it, not just members in this chamber, but the people of Scotland who want to live in a country that's inclusive and has zero tolerance for those who stir up hatred with intent to abuse and discriminate against minorities. I'm proud to support the general principles of this bill today. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, well, absolutely no time left. So if people go over time, we're going to end up with an even later decision time or cutting speeches at the end. Ruth Maguire, followed by Margaret Mitchell.
Crimes driven by hatred and prejudice have deep social consequences, not just the physical and psychological damage to the victim of the crime, but also to the group the victim belongs to and our wider community as a whole. As parliamentarians, we have a duty to work together to ensure that we do our utmost to protect those who are most vulnerable and targeted by hate so they can live their lives freely. The volume of interest and engagement with this bill from such diverse stakeholders has reflected not only the importance of this matter, but also the importance of the cross-party committee and bill process as a whole. Presiding Officer, I'm very grateful to the Justice Committee for all their work at Stage 1 and would also commend the Cabinet Secretary for his approach in listening to concerns raised and acting on them. I think that having the debate in advance of Stage 1 was extremely helpful in that regard, and I appreciate that the Scottish Government is accepting the overwhelming majority of the Justice Committee's recommendations, including strengthening protection for freedom of expression provisions, ensuring the test of the term abusive in the bill is an objective test, and removing Section 5 from the bill, which dealt with possession of inflammatory materials. While doing everything we can to ensure Scotland is a place where there's zero tolerance of hate crime, we must ensure that we strike the right balance between respecting, protecting and upholding all rights, including free speech. Freedom of speech, of course, carries with it duties and responsibilities and can be legitimately subject to conditions, restrictions or penalties in the interests of, amongst other things, public safety and the prevention of disorder or crime. This bill cannot and does not prevent people expressing controversial, challenging or offensive views, nor should it seek to stifle criticism or rigorous debate in any way. The bill includes some explicit provisions on freedom of expression. However, the bill's provisions are required to be interpreted in accordance with the European Convention of Human Rights anyway. The ECHR guarantees all of us the right to protest and to protest or express views, even if they shock, offend or disturb others. And I would acknowledge Rhoda Grant's points about whether we should have to rely on that for judgments. I welcome the Scottish Government's movement around stirring up and noted the positive reception given to that by many organisations who were initially concerned. Lisa Clark from Scottish Pen states, the Cabinet Secretary's amendment to focus on the requirement to prove intention to stir up hatred is welcomed and has eased our anxieties about the potential for a chilling effect on writers. Presiding Officer, I want to talk about misogyny, an area which is not covered by the bill but does nonetheless require urgent attention. The Cabinet Secretary highlighted the impact hate crime has on the individuals targeted and their wider group. And the impact on the lives of women and girls of misogyny should not be underestimated. We are, of course, over 50% of the population, so women and girls experiencing misogyny make up a sizable proportion of our citizens. Reflecting on the evidence provided to the Justice Committee, I agree with them that it's wise to wait until the working group on misogynistic harassment has reported before Parliament considers legislating to add sex as a hate crime characteristic. This is undoubtedly a complex matter, and there are many differing views around how to best approach it from a criminal justice perspective. There's no single definition in law which is commonly used in a criminal context to encapsulate the breadths of behaviours which come under that umbrella term of misogyny. Evidence from Engender around international examples concluded that looking to other states and at current work on violence against women and criminal justice systems in Scotland and Europe, that not only would a sex aggravator do nothing to make women safer, but it may also have unintended and harmful consequences. I understand why women, as Engender were, would be instinctively drawn to a sex aggravator. I certainly was, but it's crucial that we legislate in a way that best protects women and girls. And at the moment, it looks like this is not the way to go. We will, of course, have to wait to see what the working group concludes. The appointment of Baroness Kennedy and the Scottish Government commitment in principle to develop a standalone offence of misogynistic harassment is welcome. And I acknowledge that it will be up to the Chair to agree the overall time scale to deliver what's being asked of them. I would, however, like to press the Cabinet Secretary a little to say more on that front. I think at a time when misogyny feels like it's at epidemic levels, it would be helpful to women and girls in Scotland to hear the Government reaffirm that misogyny is taken just as seriously as other hate crimes, and effective action will be taken as soon as possible. In Baroness Kennedy's own words, the law has often failed to provide adequate remedies and justice for the harassment, assault and sexual violence experienced by women. Women have had to fight hard to properly criminalise such behaviour. The everyday abuse of women too often involves verbal degradation of the darkest and most threatening crime. Presiding Officer, confronting all hate crime is central to building the safer, stronger and inclusive Scotland we all want to see. I'll be proud to support this at stage 1 tonight. Thank you.
Margaret Mitchell, followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, DPO. Can I begin by thanking the Justice Clerks, who always do a superb job compiling Stage 1 reports, but who have performed a Herculean feat in, together with SPICE, analysing the staggering 2,000 responses to the committee's call for evidence and compiling the Stage 1 report on what is one of the Scottish Parliament's most contentious bills in its 21 years of existence. Hate crime is vile and should and must be acknowledged, recognised, addressed and dealt with proportionately, fairly and effectively in a number of ways, through training, education, awareness and, yes, where necessary, under the rule of law. However, legislation in itself is not a panacea for tackling hate crime, but may and should, where appropriate, be another tool in the box to address it. The Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill was introduced by the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, Humza Yousaf, on the 23rd of April 2020 and seeks to consolidate all existing Scottish hate crime legislation into one new hate crime statute and to modernise and extend existing hate crime legislation in Scotland by including age as an additional characteristic and creating a new offence of stirring up hatred. I want to spend a moment focusing on the age provision within the bill. According to Dr. Hannah Bowes, her research on age, which the Justice Committee commissioned, then seeking to recognise and respond to elderly abuse through specific criminal offences or by widening access to the hate crime framework to include older age, will neither reduce violence and nor abuse or improve prosecution and violence rates, but may exacerbate and inequalities and potentially facilitate further devaluation of older people. And she concludes that there are significant issues with extending legislation to older people based on the vulnerable older adult arguments. And here the Justice Committee notes Dr. Bowes' conclusion that the approach to elder abuse should be one based on vulnerability and not age. Significantly, the committee further notes Lord Brackadale's recommendation that the Scottish Government should consider the introduction, out with the hate crime scheme, of a general aggravation covering exploitation of people based on vulnerability. I agree. The bill is in 5 parts, but it is part 2, creating the new offence of stirring up hatred, which is the most controversial aspect of this deeply flawed legislation. Part 2, stirring up hatred provisions are misguided and have attracted the following justified criticism from numerous and varied contributors. Police Scotland state the provisions create a hierarchy of discrimination which could bring the justice system into disrepute. For example, the inclusion of insulting on a set of characteristics but not in another set. The Scottish Police Federation say they could move policing away from criminalising deeds and acts to what people think and feel, as well as criminalising what is said in private. Freedom of speech is one of the fundamental freedoms in any civilised democracy, and the Law Society warns that the bill lacks clarity and could threaten freedom of speech. For example, religion and sexual orientation are protected, but these protections do not exist in other characteristics. The Sheriffs Association states the bill creates the possibility of exposing artists, performers and academics to potential criminality. And both Rowan Atkinson, actor, and crime writer Val McDermott have stated it could result in stifling free expression. Will I get time back if I take an intervention?
No, you won't get time back.
I apologise, I'm not being able to do that. It seems to me, therefore, despite the Cabinet Secretary's intention to remove Section 4 regarding theatre and public performances from the bill, the whole issue of context in which remarks are made and thoughts develop has not been properly considered. Furthermore, the rest of the UK jurisdictions, in their private conversations in the home are excluded, but not in Scotland under this bill. And prosecutions for stirring up hatred require the permission of the Attorney General or the Director of Private Scotland, but not in Scotland. Under this bill, the Lord Advocate's consent is not required. Presiding Officer, it is unprecedented that before beginning the scrutiny of a bill, the Justice Committee took evidence from the Cabinet Secretary first to allow him to state the proposed amendments and substantial changes he proposed to make to the legislation at stage 2. But crucially, legislation, if it is to be fit for purpose, must be drafted with care and precision. Words and their meaning matter, and the fundamental changes already proposed and the necessary ones being discussed today are evidence this is rushed and flawed legislation. Given this, in my view, the bill should be withdrawn now, properly considered in the future and brought back in the next session of Parliament.
Fulton McGregor, followed by James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Justice Committee, I want to start by putting on record my thanks to the clerks for their tireless work in the scrutiny of this bill. It really has been some effort by everybody involved, but the clerks particularly. And I also want to pay tribute to all members of the committee from all parties for the collaborative nature of the scrutiny. There's been a lot of publicity out there about this bill in the media saying that it's controversial, flawed or contentious, and we've heard some of those words today as well. And I think it's quite easy to get sucked in to all of that, but it's not really what we found in committee at all. Witness after witness were generally supportive of the principles of the bill, although some had concerns, which I'll come to and we've already heard about. And members worked together to improve the bill, and I think our Stage 1 report is a fair reflection of that. And that is the main issue here. We all want to tackle the plague of hate crime in our country because it is real, and we know that, and we've heard it in committee and in this Parliament many, many times. And a few weeks ago, the Cabinet Secretary came to the Racial Equality cross-party group that I chair to talk about the bill, a large group of organisations supporting those most affected by such crimes, and who in the main, as you can imagine, were very positive about the principles of the bill, and indeed agreed to write to the government to say that following his presentation. There's not one committee member or party not committed to tackling hate crime, and we worked from that platform. We want to do this in a way that does not impinge on freedom of speech, and this bill does just that. And perhaps our first recommendation, as Rona Mackay has already read out, best sums it up, and I think I'll read it out again because it is important. The committee agrees that the right to freedom of speech includes the right to offend, shock or disturb. The committee understands that this bill is not intended to prohibit speech which others may find offensive, and neither is it intended to lead to any self-censorship. The committee is anxious to ensure, however, that these are not unintended consequences of the bill. And, Presiding Officer, that last bit is quite important about unintended consequences, because we all have a duty as parliamentarians to ensure that there are no unintended consequences, and that part of that is helping the public to understand what the bill does do and what it doesn't do. And that all said, the committee has done its job, as evidence clearly led us to aspects of the bill that needed to be changed, and the Cabinet Secretary has already spoken about these and the amendments he will bring forward at stage 2. And as others have rightly said, he came to the committee at an earlier stage. In terms of stirring up hatred, we heard significant concerns about these, even if there were potential for these to be exaggerated. It goes back to my earlier point that it's right to address this head on. So in the report, we welcome the Cabinet Secretary proposal that the bill be amended at stage 2 to make the stirring up offences with intent only, with the exception of race. And similarly, we received a lot of evidence with concerns around section 4, where the offence is committed as part of a public performance, and I think the Cabinet Secretary committing to removing this section is the right move. And again, with section 5, offences of possessing inflammatory material, we heard a lot of concerns about this. The committee report actually made some suggestions in terms of providing more clarity in these issues that may ease anxieties, but it's the Cabinet Secretary who's went further than this, and has actually said in his response that he's seeking to remove the section altogether, so going further than the committee on this occasion. And I believe that these are all indicators of a government working collaboratively to bring forward the best legislation possible. Presiding Officer, in other parts of the bill, I welcome the government's agreement that there are plans to deepen the freedom and expression provision for religion, and also for his intentions that he's raised today to bring forward amendments at stage 2 to add freedom of expression clauses for the protected characteristics of transgender identity and age. I think these are very welcome additions to the bill. In terms of the individual hate crime characteristics, I very much agree that race should be treated differently in relation to offences of stirring up racial hatred. The history and sheer volume of this nature points to this outcome, and what the stakeholder groups, I think, would expect. And an area where we heard, broadly speaking, two strongly held views is on whether or not sex should be included as a hate crime characteristic. I think my colleague Ruth Maguire summed this debate up pretty well. For example, Dr Marsha Scott, Scottish Women's Aid, worried that such a move might have unintended negative consequences. Engender agreed, commenting that rushing to legislate runs the risk of entrenching that misunderstanding, furthering criminal justice bodies and public understanding in women's perception of what the state will or will not tolerate for them. However, there were strong arguments on the other side of the debate, including from Lucy Hunter-Blackburn, who told us it's really important that people see themselves in the bill. A group of people who cannot see themselves in the bill are those who are subjected to any kind of abusive behaviour or harassment based on their sex. So ultimately, Presiding Officer, the committee unanimously came to the same place on this as the Scottish Government have, that both cases were strong, and we need the working group that has been established to do its work and report back to Parliament on this issue. I know we have suggested a timescale of a year for this, but ultimately I accept this is for the group to decide. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, this is a good bill. It won't solve every problem, it won't do everything, but it's a real potential to change lives and help tackle hate and prejudice. I hope today's debate has tackled some of the myths of the bill and demonstrated that the committee is working to improve it and make as good legislation as possible. I'm disappointed to hear, I only heard it today, that Conservatives will not be voting for the general principles, but I certainly will, and I'd encourage others to do so. Thank you.
James Kelly, please, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. First of all, can I pay tribute to the Justice Committee, and particularly the clerks, who have done an outstanding job in getting the evidence considered by the committee, bearing in mind a huge volume of submissions, and also the fact that we're dealing with a very complicated bill in difficult circumstances with a pandemic. Hate and prejudice has no place in a modern, progressive society, and from that point of view, anything that can be done in terms of legislation and other means to root out perpetrators of hate and prejudice, and also to provide proper protection for victims, has got to be very much welcomed. The context in this legislation being brought forward was the Brackendale Review, and there was broad agreement that legislation that tidied up the legal process, made it more efficient and provided more clarity was welcome. However, it's fair to say that when the bill was published, it's run into areas of difficulty. To me, in terms of getting legislation through Parliament, aside from obviously the parliamentary process, there are two areas that need to be considered. Does the legislation have public support, and also does it provide legal clarity? When the Justice Committee ran its consultation, there was a vast number of responses raising concern, and I think it takes a great deal to get the Police Federation, the Catholic Church and the Law Society all on the one page criticising the bill. So in terms of the original publication, it failed that in terms of getting public support. I think also if you look at the Law Society's submission, where they said that the bill lacked legal clarity, the potential for it was it ran into the same difficulties as the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, when whether you were a football supporter, a police officer or someone in the judiciary, there was a lot of confusion as to what constituted a legal issue under that legislation. And yes, I'll take an interview.
Just very briefly, I think it's a reasonable point he's making. And does he then agree with the Law Society that putting things in the explanatory notes is not a sufficient substitute for actually putting things on the face of the bill?
James Kelly.
Yeah, I take that point, and I'll come on to the Law Society's substantive submission ahead of this debate. But what I would say is that the bill as published, clearly had issues with it. It was clearly flawed. And I think from that regard, the committee has done an excellent job in interrogating the bill, and has also done the Cabinet Secretary a favour in relation to the interactions. It shows you how badly drafted the bill has been when the Cabinet Secretary has on 3 occasions had to come back to the committee with clarifications and commitments as to what amendments are going to be required. But fair play to him, he at least has interacted with that process and has come up with amendments, because there were clearly a number of issues with the legislation. A lot of the concentration on the debate this afternoon has been around Part 2 on the stirring up hatred offence, and also the point specifically raised by Liam Kerr there. And I think even the fact that the Cabinet Secretary this afternoon has said that he'll consider putting a definition of what abusive behaviour means in terms of stirring up hatred on the face of the bill shows how far he has come. Clearly there have been issues around freedom of expression that have been raised from religious groups, and also we've heard about the problems that theatrical groups and theatres had in relation to performances. So I think there's a lot of issues being considered in the committee report that require further attention. One issue that I would raise in terms of data in relation to Part 1 of the bill, I think that is well drafted, and that is welcome in relation to the consolidation of offences. However, Bemis have made the point in their submission that the lack of data around disaggregated hate crime it doesn't allow us to properly interrogate the statistics around hate crime. And I think that's something that should be addressed at stage 2. So, in summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, I think the bill in its initial draft was flawed. There were difficulties. I think the committee have done an excellent job in flushing out some of those difficulties and highlighting improvements. I think the Cabinet Secretary has interacted with that. However, there's still a good way to go, and these amendments will have to be thoroughly and robustly tested at stage 2 to ensure that the concerns that people have raised around Part 2 have been addressed. For us to do that, we need that appropriate balance between correctly tackling hate crime but balancing freedom of speech. The job in stage 2 is still to be done in that.
Thank you very much. And I call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to have been called to speak in the Stage 1 debate on the hate crime bill this afternoon. And as the Cabinet Secretary referred in his opening remarks, I have a particular interest in the subject. And as a newish member of the Justice Committee, I too would wish to pay tribute to the very significant work carried out by the clerks and by Spice. And also I would thank everybody who took the time to make the submission. I would also just remind members of my entry in the Register of Interest, wherein they will note that I am a member of the Law Society of Scotland. I hold a current practising certificate, albeit that I'm not currently practising. Presiding Officer, there's been a lot of noise surrounding this bill, but also a lot of studious and diligent work pursued out of the glare of tabloid newspaper headlines and Twitter. And it is that studious and diligent work that I would wish to focus on, for we all have engaged and we all are engaged in a very serious undertaking, and that is to ensure that every citizen has confidence that the criminal justice system works for them and is not beyond their reach. Indeed, as I think it was pointed out, there is a risk that some are overly focused on the theoretical impact of the bill rather than the actual impact of actual hate crime on real people. But that is not to say that we are not duty-bound to do our utmost to get the balance right. And of course, that is in essence the balance set forth in Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, as between, on the one hand, the freedom of expression, and on the other hand, the recognition that such a freedom carries with it duties and responsibilities. That is the key point I would submit, Presiding Officer. And in this regard, I am pleased to note that the Cabinet Secretary has listened to the concerns that have been raised and is considering addressing these concerns by strengthening the freedom of expression provisions in the bill. Obviously, we wait to see the detail, but I think it is very encouraging indeed that the Cabinet Secretary has signalled his intentions, as I believe that the strengthening of the freedom of expression provisions in the bill will indeed secure the requisite balance we need to seek as a matter of law. In the limited time available, I would wish to focus on one issue that I indeed focused on during the committee deliberations, and that was the characteristic of sex, which of course is a protected characteristic under the 2010 Equality Act. As we have heard, the bill as currently drafted does not include within its scope the characteristic of sex. Its submission reflects, I understand, a long-standing debate about how best to tackle the scale of the problem faced by women in this area. In the evidence the committee received, I was struck in particular by the detailed arguments put forward by Engender and other organisations to the effect that symmetrical approaches to the issue have demonstrably not worked to date. In this regard, the Istanbul Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence was cited, and indeed has been cited this afternoon, and it was recalled that it provides for a presumption against gender-neutral laws. It is on this basis that the Scottish Government is, I understand, proposing to set up a working group to be chaired, as we have heard, by Baroness Helena Kennedy, to look specifically at two issues. The first, whether the characteristic of sex should be in due course included on the face of the legislation, and secondly, whether in addition there should be a standalone offence of misogynistic harassment. Presiding Officer, having considered this matter very carefully indeed, and taking into account the very important point that the working group will also address the addition of the characteristic of sex in the bill, and of course not wishing to prejudge the detailed analysis that that working group will carry out, which is much needed given the scale of the problem that affects women in this area. I do support this approach at this time, with the caveat that the working group should indeed complete its report within 12 months, as these key issues must be addressed, and there can be no kicking this issue, even inadvertently, into the long grass. I am reassured in this regard by the evidence from the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service that there would, in the absence of a statutory aggravator, be nothing to prevent prosecutions from taking place in relation to cases that are reported at present. I'm also, I would have to say, not persuaded at this time by the submissions that the committee received from some organisations which tended to suggest a conflation of the motivation for this working group approach, with in fact other debates currently being had on the immutability of sexual dimorphism and the importance of not conflating sex and gender. These are very important issues, and these will be indeed debated as the months go ahead. But I don't believe, I am not convinced, that this issue of the working group is in any way intended to impact negatively on that debate. Presiding Officer, I note that my time, I've been timing myself on my phone here, is just about up, but I would wish to conclude by quoting from Lord Brackadale, who, when giving evidence to the committee on his review of hate crime, said, and I quote, "I identified a number of functions that make hate crime legislation necessary. It marks and underlines the additional harm that hate crime causes to the victim, other members of the protected group and wider society. It has an important symbolic function in sending out a message that such behaviour will not be tolerated." I entirely agree with that statement. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I now call Liz Smith to be followed by John Mason.
A challenge there, I think, Deputy Presiding Officer. Firstly, I want to put on record my thanks to members of the Justice Committee and to its convener, my colleague Adam Tompkins, for what is without doubt an extremely thorough, thoughtful and well-balanced report. And given the nature of the subject, it cannot have been an easy task to grapple with such complex legal issues, including those of disputed definitions, such as abusive action or inflammatory material, or the word insulting. And whilst the committee took the view that Lord Brackadale's distinction between hate crime and other crimes was helpful, there remained the hugely complex and at times very controversial task of striking the right balance between allowing extensive freedom of expression with the need to punish hateful action and thereby protect the public. And paragraph 38 in the report sets out this challenge in a nutshell when it says, and I quote, "Legislating on hate crime inevitably touches on fundamental rights." And these, of course, include free speech. Indeed, in recent weeks, we need only listen to the passionate, at times very bitter debate within Cambridge University as to what free speech actually constitutes and by whom it should be safeguarded to recognise just how difficult this is. Neither can it have been easy for the committee to deal with such a large volume of submissions and witness statements, always a sign that there is a very high degree of public interest in the bill, but also a wide variety of views to represent. Deputy Presiding Officer, back in September when we debated the hate crime bill in Scottish Conservative business time, I began my speech with the need to be mindful of the meaning of good law. The concept in jurisprudence which decrees that a legal decision is both valid and able to hold legal weight, not a law that has to be overturned or rendered obsolete. Good law is one which is the basis for effective policy making, and as such it requires a clarity of purpose, to be understood in simple language, to be strong in its evidence base, to be workable, and of course to be accepted by the public. In short, it should be a balance for simplicity with legal precision and adhere to the highest standards of drafting and clarity of language. And I think the Justice Committee has largely succeeded in agreeing that these are the most important principles for good lawmaking, and therefore it's got to be against these criteria that we examine the hate crime bill before us at stage one. Also in that September debate, my colleague Liam Kerr set out exactly why the Scottish Conservatives had real objection to some key sections of the bill, particularly in Part 2. And he did so because these sections of the bill would not do what the bill said it would do on the tin. And despite the good intentions, Part 2 of the hate crime bill has been seen as illiberal, intrusive and deeply flawed, and deeply unpopular with a wide range of stakeholders, and by the public, because they can see that the glaring flaws are all too available to be misinterpreted. In short, that part of the bill in particular was not striking the balance which the committee had set out in its intentions. And once again, I draw the comparison with the named persons legislation, which despite the benign intentions that were acknowledged by the Supreme Court, was so full of problems, perhaps with unintended consequences, and they were going to be seen as deeply intrusive into private family life, at the same time as giving unacceptable powers to the state and to those who are being asked to administer the scheme. And of course, we all know that when it came to the data sharing aspect of the legislation in Part 4, it was struck down by the Supreme Court. It was bad legislation, likely to give rise to illiberal action, confusion over legal responsibilities, and undermining fundamental freedoms and personal choice. And there's another parallel here. Just like the hate crime bill, the named person legislation brought together the unlikely bedfellows from a wide range of backgrounds of public opinion, and that in itself should be pause for thought. Indeed, in my extensive parliamentary experience in this chamber, that is usually a sign that something is wrong or deeply flawed. So the legislative debacles that were the named person laws and indeed the Offensive Behaviour at Football Acts must not be repeated. The hate crime bill has some good intentions, but as it stands now, it is in bad need of reform. There are still debates to be had at stage 2 about tightening up on language so that there can be no misinterpretation or ambivalence about proposed law, debates about strengthening the free speech clauses, and whether there is a need to create a prosecution lock when it comes to the issue of stirring up offences. And there is also a debate to be had about how to ensure that there is a better recording of hate crimes. Of course, legislative changes will not do everything. I was very struck by the committee's view that there is an important role for education in all of this, and I wholeheartedly agree. And whilst that will be a matter for another committee, we must not lose sight of its importance. Presiding Officer, the process of scrutiny has been increasingly under the spotlight in this Parliament, not always for good reasons, and we must not repeat past mistakes, which certainly in my 14 years here have been more frequent in recent times. We owe it to our constituents to ensure that bad law has no place in Scottish politics, and that is why the Cabinet Secretary for Justice must both listen carefully to and respond to the concerns of the committee, most especially in my view in relation to Part 2. So I thank the committee again for its excellent work. It has been no easy task, but I respect them and the committee members and my colleague Adam Tompkins for all that they have achieved.
Thank you very much. I call John Mason to be followed by Alec Rowley.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. As members know, I'm not a member of the Justice Committee, but I have been taking an interest in this bill, not least because a number of faith groups have taken strong lines on it. Also, as convener of the cross-party group on freedom of religion or belief, we spend a lot of our time considering both hate crime in other countries and the need for freedom of expression in those same places. I guess there's always going to be a tension between freedom of speech and expression on the one hand and protecting vulnerable and potentially vulnerable groups from verbal and other abuse on the other hand. As someone who broadly seeks to adhere to biblical or traditional Christianity, I very much want to have that freedom of speech, which allows us to go out into the marketplace and share our faith and encourage people of all faiths and none to see that following Jesus Christ is the only way to God. People might strongly disagree with that statement that I've just made, but hopefully no one is suggesting it is inherently hateful. And logically, I must then be happy to allow other groups to be critical of Jesus and of Christians and to encourage us to follow a secular or other path. After all, the person at the centre of our faith was insulted and killed on a cross, so being insulted from time to time is not something that comes as a huge surprise for followers of Jesus, and to some extent we expect it. So freedom of speech and expression is hugely important. Then, with my CPG hat on, I very much see the need for protecting vulnerable groups. That is the very reason for this bill. This is certainly the case in Scotland and the UK, but it is even more the case in a number of other countries. It seems to me that if legislation like this was passed in a country like China or Pakistan or India, it would be a huge help and encouragement to minority groups there, be that Falun Gong, the Uyghur or Tibetans in China, Muslims and Sikhs in India, or Christians in Pakistan. So I accept we're trying to get the balance right between these different values, freedom of speech, as well as protecting some of the most vulnerable sections of our community. And it is worth noting, as Rhoda Grant's already mentioned, the warning from Ephraim Borowski of the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities, that we do not go so far the other way that freedom of expression takes over and we give a get-out-of-jail-free card to any kind of hate speech. The bill has always been very clear in sections 11 and 12 that freedom of expression is protected and we can criticise each other's views on religion or sexual practices. And ECHR also guarantees the right to protest and express views even if they shock, offend or disturb others. So I have to say I think the original bill was acceptable in this regard. However, there clearly has been a feeling that freedom of speech needs a bit more underlining, and I have no problem with that. So I understand the government proposes both a widening out and a deepening of freedom of expression, and that is to be welcomed. I think it was suggested by some that there should be a blanket guarantee of freedom of expression to replace sections 11 and 12. However, I would tend to agree with the government in their response that this is not desirable or required for race and disability. As Scotland and the UK become increasingly secular, some religious people certainly feel that they and their beliefs are under threat. There is a suggestion of religion being a private affair and that it has no place in the public square. So I actually think this bill can help protect religious people from overly aggressive, hardline secularists. From that perspective, it disappoints me that some religious groups appear to be opposing the bill per se. I thought that Inclusion Scotland made a good point when they said they, quote, are concerned that consideration of the bill has been overly focused on the theoretical impact of the bill on freedom of expression rather than the actual impact of hate crime on real people, including disabled people. There had been concern about possessing inflammatory material and whether that might cover even owning religious scriptures like the Bible or the Quran. I have to say that I did not feel there was a problem with this, but again, if the government is proposing to remove Section 5, then that sounds like a positive step to reassure people. Concerning the suggestion that private dwellings should be removed from the criminal law, I would be wary of this. As Michael Clancy from the Law Society said, quote, there is no sanctuary in that sense for most aspects of the criminal law, and I do not think there should be a sanctuary when it comes to hate speech, unquote. I think we pretty well know that a lot of racism and sectarianism does stem from the home and from the family. So ultimately, in extreme cases, we need to be willing to tackle that. We have had a fair number of briefings in preparation for today's debate, and a number of points have particularly struck me. For example, the Equality Network and Scottish Trans Alliance emphasised the importance of non-legislative action, and I know BEMIS have spoken about that too. Training for the police, appropriate treatment for victims and public awareness campaigns are all vital. We know that organisations like Show Racism the Red Card and others are doing valuable educational work with young people around sectarianism, and we certainly want to see more of that kind of thing. So overall, I very much support this bill, and I'm pleased that the Justice Committee were able to recommend that the general principles of the bill be approved, subject to appropriate amendments. Hamza Yousaf has been very proactive in proposing amendments to alleviate many of the concerns raised, and I welcome that. So I certainly do hope that Parliament will support the bill at stage 1. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call Alec Rowley to be followed by Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In opening my remarks, I would have to make the point that the way the Cabinet Secretary and the SNP government have brought forward this legislation leaves a lot to be desired. The policy memorandum accompanying the bill states that, and I quote, the bill provides for the modernisation, consolidating and extending of hate crime legislation in Scotland. Legislation in this area has evolved over time in a fragmented manner, with the result that different elements of hate crime law are located in different statutes. There is a lack of consistency, and the relevant legislation is not as user-friendly as it could be. The new hate crime legislation will provide greater clarity, transparency and consistency. So you would have to say, that seems like a good objective. But as we know and has been acknowledged by the government, the draft bill published by the government was pretty poor and raised more concerns than it did offer answers. I note that the committee report states that a substantial proportion of respondents, including most individuals, had concerns about the impact of hate crime laws on freedom of speech and religious expression, and about laws designated to protect specific groups. Many called for the repeal of hate crime laws, or at least did not want such laws to be extended. These views shaped the response of the consultation, the committee said. And I have to say, this reflects many of the contacts that I have received from individuals raising their concerns and calling for parts of the bill to be scrapped, as they believe the bill will threaten freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And therefore, while some have praised the Cabinet Secretary for willing to compromise, I believe that bringing forward such an ill-considered and ill-drafted bill has been a major folly. And the danger with that is that we allow this bill to be politicised in a way that it should not have been, and we allow political parties, as we're seeing tonight, where the Tories are not even prepared to allow, despite the hard work of the committee, to allow this bill to go forward to the next stage. As most organisations, I would have to say, have said in terms of supporting the principle of the bill, it becomes politicised and people use it for political gain to try and get political votes. And that's the real problem, and that is the major mistake that the Cabinet Secretary brought forward when he brought forward a piece of legislation that was simply not fit for purpose, and he should acknowledge that. I'm certainly clear that hate and prejudice have no place in Scotland, and that it is important to have clear and robust laws to deal with hate crimes committed within our society. I'm equally supportive of the overall principles of the hate crime bill and agree that it's important to consolidate hate crime legislation into one body of law. And I believe that the evidence that from the different organisations that we have had over this last week or so and the work of the committee is also supportive of the principle of this bill. It is welcome that the Scottish Government has conceded that amendments are necessary to make Part 2 of the bill fit for purpose, requiring intent for the new stirring-up offence will be an improvement to the provisions. However, Scottish Labour still have concerns about the bill as currently drafted and agree that improvements are still needed to Part 2 to ensure that it includes adequate protections for freedom of speech and thought, and it does not criminalise legitimate views. Although it's encouraging that the Cabinet Secretary has shown willingness to improve the freedom of expression provision in the bill, we believe that he should set out further how he intends to amend this area generally and in section 12 of the bill. Public understanding of the bill will rely on clarity within the legislation over the terms used. That's why we believe and support the committee's recommendation for improvements to the definitions used within the bill so that the language is up to date and the application of provisions such as reasonable defence are clear. So I would urge the Cabinet Secretary not to take a view that is arrogant and failing to acknowledge the failures in bringing this bill forward in the way he did. Work together. The committee have done a great deal of work to try and bail him out. Work together. And I would urge the Tories not to play politics, because this is a key piece of legislation that, done right, is good for Scotland.
Thank you very much. And I call Richard Lyle, who will be followed by Shona Robison, who will be the last open debate speaker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The debate over this bill has been one of the most intense that I can remember. In the last 6 months, strong views have been expressed by a huge range of people: lawyers, police officers, academics, journalists, actors, writers, women's campaigners and faith groups. The bill has generated hundreds of newspaper headlines, thousands of submissions to Parliament and, as other colleagues will attest, a great deal of correspondence from constituents. The people of Uddingston and Bellsall have been very vocal about this, and I owe to them today to raise these concerns. Among the many emails I have received in regard to this bill, and I'll read from a few. Mary said, "Please take a stand and require amendments to protect freedom of speech and private conversations." This constituent is concerned that speaking from the comfort of her own home will be turned against her. Yes, if people are plotting a hate crime and indeed a terrorist crime, they should face the full force of the law. This may be just newspaper hype, but it needs to be explained. Anne says people must be allowed to express their views in their own home without the threat of police intervention. She asks about the dwelling defence. Otherwise, an innocent remark could be and will be blown up. She further states, do we really want to interfere in people's private lives? These questions must be answered. Thomas also stated the same. I want to ask and try to answer two questions today. Firstly, why has the bill received such a strong reaction from the public? And secondly, how should we proceed in light of this? There is no question in my mind as to the laudable aims of this bill. Crimes motivated by hatred, prejudice, are a blight on society, and the government, like me, wants to see them punished. I support that intention, but any law must be measured and supported by the general public. However, good intentions are not enough in of themselves. There are many laws which have been passed by this Parliament that are well motivated, but had to be improved in their various stages, and this bill is a prime example. We have to ensure that this bill meets the test of ridding ourselves of hate, whether it's because of race, religion or sexual orientation. No self-respecting person should hate another person just because of their race, their colour, sexual orientation, religion or even their politics. We're all occupying a small planet, and we must rise above that and learn to live and work with each other. The consequences of a well-motivated but poorly executed legislation are very serious indeed. We're talking here about new offences that will bring citizens into contact with the criminal justice system. We have to ensure that these offences tackle hate and bigotry, but in a measured way. The proposals in this bill may have significant far-reaching consequences for individuals, families and communities. It's crucial we get this legislation right the first time, instead of picking up the pieces later, after the damage has been done. I think this concern about the delay, the detail of legislation, answers my first question about why the hate crime bill has caused such concern. Stirring up hatred offences in Part 2 of the bill are highly subjective. The scope of these offences has not been defined. I'm sure after today they will. I'm sure that as this bill progresses, these will be resolved. I'm grateful for the Government amendments promised at Stage 2. These will certainly provide more clarity. There's still a wide concern about the definitions in the bill. What does the term hatred mean? In today's world, merely disagreeing with certain ideas is considered hateful by certain people. That is the world we live in, and that's what we have to deal with. Vague stirring up hatred laws could give people a tool to punish their political opponents and pursue personal grievances through the courts. As far as I'm concerned, my second question, if you remember, was how we should proceed. If we were to ask to support the mere consolidation of laws, all of us would be on board. But Part 2 presents a real problem. Given the concerns I have expressed on behalf of my constituents, I ask the Government to try to resolve many of the questions that are being asked and that have already been asked today in this debate. There are risks associated with this bill that need to be discussed and resolved, and I, for one, think the Cabinet Secretary is trying to do that. And as I've already said, hate and bigotry have no place in modern society, and I welcome the intentions of this bill, and I will support it tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, and I call Shona Robinson, who will be the final speaker in the open debate. Shona Robinson.
Thank you very much. Like others, can I begin by thanking the Justice Committee clerks in particular, who have done a tremendous job, my colleagues across the different parties in working in a very constructive and consensual way, those giving evidence, and of course Lord Brackadale, whose report lies behind this important bill to modernise hate crime law. I also want to thank the Cabinet Secretary for his approach to the bill. I think that has been very important to get us where we are today, and that is that the Scottish Government has so far accepted 33 out of 39 recommendations. That's about 85%. I think that shows his willingness to reach compromise and consensus. There's been huge movement so far on the stirring up offences, welcomed by stakeholders, on the strengthening of freedom of speech, also welcomed by stakeholders, the removal of reference to theatrical performances, now further movement on police powers of entry and further movement on freedom of expression and other characteristics, all very welcome and in line, of course, with the committee recommendations. The Cabinet Secretary has also made clear that threatening and abusive must have an objective test. The question is how this is best expressed, and the Cabinet Secretary has left the door open on this, including exploring further whether this could be on the face of the bill. Also, the reasonableness defence, I think, is a difficult one, and the Cabinet Secretary outlined the difficulty of finding an example. I think the committee acknowledged this in the report, and I think that is something for us to give further consideration to. I want to turn to a couple of the comments made in this debate. Margaret Mitchell seemed to be suggesting that one of the reasons for not supporting the bill was the retention of insulting within the race characteristic. And I just want to say a couple of things about that. I think it's very important that we recognise the distinct approach to race, that there is a different legal threshold, due, of course, to the prevalence of racial hatred as an issue. And I don't want to see insulting removed, as I think it would weaken the existing legislation, and I think it would send a really, really bad message. So I would hope that members would agree with that. I also I think it's disappointing that after all of the movement that I just outlined in the beginning of my speech, that Liam Kerr has said that the Tories won't support the stage one principles of this bill. I really don't think that's in keeping with the tone and consensual nature of the way the committee has worked, or indeed the report. I have some sympathy for the point made by Rhoda Grant about the omission of sex as a protected characteristic. However, we do now have a working group looking at the need for a standalone offence on misogyny under the very expert chairing of Helena Kennedy. And I think, having been asked to do that job, we probably really ought to allow her and the expert group to get on with that job. But I do think we need to keep a watching brief to make sure that is done in a reasonable time frame. I want to end, presiding officer, with the fact that we need to always remember that at the heart of this are those who are the victims of hate crime. And we sometimes forget that, and it gets lost in some of the detail about some legal debates around this bill. But we have to remember that that's what this bill is about, and crucial if we're going to help to create the inclusive Scotland that we want to see. That without doubt this bill has been on a journey, and I think today we've reached a large degree of consensus. So I'm very pleased to support the principles of this bill and hope that that consensual approach will continue as we enter the next stage of this important bill.
Thank you very much. We now move to closing speeches, and I call on Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's been a very interesting debate. And the balance, I think everyone agrees, between hate crime and freedom of speech needs to be reached, because this bill should not chill debate. It shouldn't stop disagreement and argument, because that is the only way we ever reach consensus, if we are allowed to speak and freely express our opinions. Every speaker, I think, agrees, but it was a point made by James Kelly that hate crime has no place in a modern Scotland, or indeed a modern society, and we should do everything in our power to stop that. And James Kelly and Margaret Mitchell, John Mason and others talked about what we need to do, not just through legislation, but through society, through education and other means, to educate people about hate crime, to make sure that it isn't part of a modern society. And indeed, if that were the case, and if that were to happen, we wouldn't need this legislation at all. And a lot of the speakers talked about the lack of clarity in the bill as it was drafted, and James Kelly quoted the Law Society on this. The Cabinet Secretary has clarified on 3 occasions changes to the bill, and I think those changes are to be welcomed. But as Alec Riley pointed out, something that should be universally supported by both this Parliament and indeed those outside this Parliament lack that degree of support because of the very poor quality of drafting. A point made by Richard Lyall that the backlash to doing something that we should all be looking to support was unexpected, but that was because of the poor drafting of the bill. And we need to be very careful, I think it was Liz Smith said, because if we make bad law, that is worse than not making law at all. And sadly, it's been practice in this Parliament towards the end of the Parliament where legislation is being pushed through, maybe without the chance of proper scrutiny or indeed the time to pause for thought. Quite often that legislation has been found to be flawed and needs to be returned to. So I would make the plea that time has to be allowed to amend this bill at stage 2 to reflect on whether those amendments get it right, because we need to get it right, and I'd echo Richard Lyall to that effect. The Cabinet Secretary, as I said, has accepted change. I urge him to go further and accept further change, because I think that would be very important to getting this law right. Adam Tompkins highlighted committee concerns about the terminology on the bill, about the terminology and the explanation of abusive. It needs to be on the face of the bill. People need to understand the terminology used in the bill and have that interpreted so that there is no doubt as to what it means. Abusive needs to be threatening. It needs to be believed to be abusive by reasonable people. And I think it's important that we put that on the bill, because that interpretation has to be clear, not to chill debate and disagreement, as Alec Riley said. Joanne Lamont, in her intervention, I think, to the Cabinet Secretary, showed how accusing somebody of hatred in itself can be used to try and silence their voice, their opinion and their viewpoint. And we need to be very careful that this bill does not do that. A number of people talked about the aggravation of sex and indeed misogyny. And Ruth Maguire talked about the increasing levels of misogyny in society. And that is, I think, concerning for all of us. And it is more complex than hate crime in that it deals with power relationships, and that women are not a minority. Indeed, they are probably the majority, but the way that they are treated and misogyny makes their place in society unequal. And it's a shame that this bill will be passed before the working group reports, because actually it should have been the other way around. We should have had a crime of misogyny, and that would have dealt with these arguments had that been done first. But the fact that we're going to have a gap where people are not protected due to sex as a characteristic is really not good enough. And again, that highlights some of the faults with this bill in the way that it has been brought forward in possibly a rushed manner without actually thinking out what we're trying to achieve by it. A number of speakers talked about insulting behaviour. I think Liam MacArthur and John Finney talked about that and explained that insulting behaviour had been included in racial hatred offences for some time, and that is retained separately in the bill. And many have argued that it's not used with reference to racial hatred prosecutions. However, I think the point was made strongly to the committee that to take it out of the legislation could perhaps signal a watering down of racial abuse protections. And that was something that would not be supported, I don't think, on any level. A number of speakers talked about theatres and plays. Liam MacArthur, Rona Mackay and others welcomed the removal of Section 4. And I fully agree with that. It's difficult to understand why theatres and the acting profession were specifically singled out in the bill. And anyone who's watched the Small Axe series of BBC on the BBC by Steve McQueen will have seen the portrayal of racial hatred that is sometimes difficult to watch, but I think important to do so. So, Presiding Officer, we all believe hate crime has no place in a modern Scotland. We want to get this bill. We will support it at stage 1, but we look for further amendments to make sure that it does what it's supposed to do without chilling debate in our society.
Thank you very much. And now Colin Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I refer to my register of interest as a member of the Faculty of Advocates? I welcome the opportunity to close for the Scottish Conservatives today in this important debate and on a piece of legislation which, as many have stated, Richard Lyle, Adam Tompkins and others, is one of the most disputed pieces of legislation ever brought before Parliament. Can I begin by joining others in thanking the Justice Committee for its considered and thorough report, which I will make reference to. And I particularly want to thank my friend and the convener of the committee, Adam Tompkins, for his remarks at the beginning of the debate in setting out some of the changes that have taken place during the committee's deliberations on the bill. From the outset, I want to reiterate the views of all of my colleagues on these benches and indeed others from across the chamber. We all, of course, abhor intolerance, bigotry, racism or prejudice of any kind. We all recognise the profound harm that hate crime causes to the victim and the community to which they belong. But on these benches, we profoundly believe that the bill still goes too far. In the debate in September, I made reference to the right to freedom of expression and the importance of preserving that right, notwithstanding the necessary constraints that have always applied to that right. It is a qualified right. There are no absolutes. I also repeat what I said in September about the Justice Secretary's own perspective on this legislation. I have never doubted his personal commitment to this bill in light of his own experiences, nor his good faith in attempting to make changes to it, nor his sincerity with which he has approached the significant, difficult and thorny issues which arise. But despite the well-intentioned moves by him and his government to make amendments to this bill, it unfortunately still falls short of what we and many people in Scotland are calling for. Now, we have stated that there are elements of the bill that we agree with. As my colleague Liam Kerr noted in his opening remarks, few, if any, witnesses to the committee had any issues with Part 1 and 4 of the bill, and many agreed with Part 3, while recognising some amendments were needed. But it is clear to us that Part 2 simply goes too far, and we remain unconvinced that the Scottish Government properly recognises this. And colleagues from across Parliament will have received hundreds of emails from constituents about this bill, and if truth be told, very few, if any, of the people who contacted me were vocal in support. Many people are concerned that if this bill is passed, it could have the potential to criminalise acts that may be considered inconsequential or acts that only cause minor offence. For instance, the National Secular Society argued that despite amendments to the bill, it felt that it would not provide comfort to writers, artists or playwrights who anticipate lengthy, expensive, stressful, sleepless months before court cases. Or the Scottish Newspaper Society, who argue that it knows from the number and nature of referrals to the Independent Press Standards Authority, many complaints are lodged on the basis of offence being taken, and this legislation creates the conditions for such grievances to move through the criminal justice system. And perhaps one of the most profound interventions was that of BBC Scotland, who stated that they strongly share the concerns expressed by the Scottish Newspaper Society around the impact of freedom of expression. Now, these are significant and stark comments from diverse and differing quarters across Scotland. And they're not alone. As I noted, and as others have noted, in my remarks to the Chamber back in September, valid and deep concerns have been expressed by Police Scotland, the Scottish Police Federation, the Faculty of Advocates, the Law Society of Scotland, to name but a few. And as Liam Kerr pointed out early on in this debate, there is also strong public opposition to this bill. Now, although it should come with the usual caveats, a poll by Savanta Comres found that 87% of Scots said that free speech is an important right in our society, and 63% think that disagreement and debate is beneficial to society. And it also found that only 29% of people feel that the law should criminalise offensive words. And as others have noticed previously, opposition to elements of this bill have come from people across the political spectrum, remarkable in and of itself. And it's clear from the significant opposition from individuals and organisations that the Scottish Government should go back and think again, and I urge them to do so. Turning briefly to the committee report, Presiding Officer, the committee concluded that support for this bill will depend on whether the Scottish Government makes the further changes to the bill needed to bring it into line with the recommendations we have agreed unanimously. And I acknowledge the Government have taken on board several of the recommendations, including the strengthening of freedom of expression protections and also the strengthening of Section 6 in relation to warrants. And indeed, as others have noticed, it also goes further than the committee recommendation to provide clarity to the provisions in Section 5 by removing that section altogether, and we welcome that. I'm sorry, I simply don't have time. I normally would, but I'm constrained. Now, we welcome that, but it is not enough. The Scottish Conservatives believe there are still elements of the bill that remain which we cannot support. There is still no protection in the bill for things that are said within the privacy of your own home. And the Section 3 stirring up of hatred offences are still wider ranging than other jurisdictions in the UK. And we remain worried that Lord Bracadale's recommendation to remove the word insulting from Section 3 has not been taken up. This, along with other vague concepts such as abusive, the word abusive, as well as the reasonableness test, mean that numerous flaws remain. And to take issue with the point made about the definition of abusive appearing on the face of the bill, criminal courts applying this legislation day to day are far more likely to have the legislation to hand rather than explanatory notes. Now, while the Scottish Government has accepted the committee's recommendation that free speech protections need to be strengthened, it has also indicated it does not intend to cover all new characteristics that are introduced with regard to the stirring up offences. To conclude, Deputy Presiding Officer, several months ago, I called on the Government to pause, to think again, and to come back to Parliament with a new bill that doesn't risk criminalising freedom of expression. We made numerous suggestions about how the bill in its current form could be strengthened, and regrettably, the Government has ignored several of those calls. And today we're being asked to support a bill which, at its heart, seeks to stamp out the scourge of hate crime, but one which also attacks the freedoms that our society holds dear. And on that principle, Deputy Presiding Officer, the Scottish Conservatives cannot, with deep regret, support this bill at stage 1.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Hamza Youssef to wind up the debate. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I first of all open by saying that this has been a constructive debate. I think there has been more light than there has been heat. I won't say that I agree with everything that's been said, but certainly I think that it has been articulated, the debate has been articulated in a constructive manner in a way to try to progress this bill forward. Because again, I reiterate and repeat what I said in my opening remarks, that although members may have disagreements about the bill, and although the Conservatives, it sounds like they will not vote for the general principles, I don't doubt any single member of that Conservative group when it comes to their commitment against hatred, bigotry and prejudice. I have been the victim of it on many occasions and had many Conservative colleagues message me and come up to me and provide their support. So I have no doubt about their intentions, but I will come back to why I'm disappointed at the stance they've taken maybe a little bit later in my remarks. Can I also open by saying that I could not agree more with the many members, if not all members, who have stated that freedom of speech is a crucial cornerstone of our democracy. Can I also agree that the legislation must not criminalise the purely offensive, shocking, or that which can be described as disturbing. In fact, the word offensive, of course, is not mentioned anywhere in the bill, a point I was keen to stress during the committee scrutiny and deliberations. What it does do in the new stirring up of hatred offences, what it does look to do and seek to do is criminalise behaviour that can be threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred. And that has to be proven beyond reasonable doubt. And again, I will come back to some of these concepts. Can I address a few of the key issues that I think have been raised by members across the chamber? Many members, Rhoda Grant, Ruth Maguire, Annabel Ewing, Shona Robinson, and many other members, in fact, have raised the issue around the misogynistic harassment working group. Can I welcome the committee's recommendation in that regard? And can I say that I was probably in the same space that the committee was in, and probably the same space that many members have been in, which was that when we were first considering the drafting of this bill, I thought it was wise to accept the recommendation that Lord Brackendale had of, as he called it, a gender aggravator. We have gone with a sex aggravator to align it with the Equality Act. But I made sure that, as with all the provisions in the bill, I listened to those who are the most affected. And when I met with those largest national organisations that represent women and tackle violence against women, they had a really strong united front. And I'm talking here about Engender, Scottish Women's Aid, Rape Crisis Scotland and Zero Tolerance. They had a really united view that a sex aggravator could potentially do more harm than good. That wasn't something that I had considered until I'd spoken to those groups. And Engender then released a report, which I think many members will have read. And I think it's really important to reflect on that issue of unintended consequences, that if we had included a sex aggravator, and of course that could still come from members at stage 2, then we would have to ensure it did not fall foul of those unintended consequences. For example, I thought Scottish Women's Aid made a very strong point that a perpetrator of domestic abuse could use a sex aggravator to continue to further that abuse against the victim or survivor of domestic abuse. And how would we guard against that? Because, of course, a sex aggravator, much like all of the aggravators, of course, is neutral. It would apply to men just as it applies to women. Just as the racial aggravator applies to a white person as much as it applies to somebody of colour. So I do think that issue is hugely important to consider. Of course, I give way to Joanne Lamont.
I appreciate very much the fact that these issues are being considered further. But can you explain to me, and maybe I've missed this, why this is uniquely a problem for hatred of women rather than the other areas where people have been targeted with hatred?
Cabinet Secretary.
The agenda report is one that I would commend to Joanne Lamont to read, because it goes into detail about how there's not a good evidential basis for where a sex aggravator has been used that has been effective to deal with misogynistic harassment. Now, Joanne Lamont might take a completely different view on that. She has every right, and our party has every right, to come forward with stage 2 amendments, but I do think it's hugely important that we consider the unintended consequences. That's not to say there will not be a sex aggravator added to this bill. In fact, I've accepted the committee recommendation that if that enabling power, that order-making power is to be used, then it should be a super affirmative order to give further parliamentary scrutiny to that. So it's not to say that there shouldn't be a sex aggravator. It's to take a moment to allow the misogynistic harassment working group, chaired by Baroness Helena Kennedy, to take its time, but not too much time, and I'll come back to that timescale point in a second, to do that work to ensure that there are no unintended consequences. And I should say that I will be speaking to Baroness Helena Kennedy about the committee's recommendations. She has indicated that she is aware of the committee's preference, a strong preference recommendation, in fact, for a 12-month timescale, and therefore we'll be having a discussion about whether or not we think the broad area of work that she's being asked to do, which is pioneering, we think potentially world-leading actually, will she be able to do that within 12 months? And if she is able to do that in 12 months, then of course we would want to be seen that that work is done in that timescale. Can I touch on a couple of other issues, Presiding Officer, that have been raised by members across the Chamber? The reasonableness defence as well. And I should caveat everything I'm saying by again just confirming that any recommendations, any amendments that are brought forward at stage 2, then the Government and I will give very serious consideration to, and we go in with an open mind. There's nothing that has been suggested thus far, neither by the committee in its report, or indeed from what I've heard from members today, that I would be completely closed-minded to and say is completely off the table. But what I would say about the reasonableness defence is, of course, that defence remains within the bill. But for those that have asked us to expand on it, for example, with a list of non-exhaustive factors, for example, is that I just repeat my challenge that I have repeated when I've appeared in front of the Justice Committee twice, and I've repeated it again today, but not to a satisfactory answer, which is, if somebody can give me an example of behaviour that was intended to stir up hatred, but as a defence was reasonable, then I would be extremely keen to hear that. Because I have put that to law experts. We have many non-practising solicitors, lawyers, and across the Chamber, law professors, of course, and others. And if they can think of an example where the reasonableness defence is needed in that regard, then I am genuinely all ears. And of course, I look forward to that in advance of stage 2. The third area, which has been stressed by a number of members, again across the Chamber, but particularly by the Conservatives, has been the issue of a public element. Those conversations in private or in the home. I noted it was the unanimous recommendation of the committee, but forgive me if I've got that incorrect, but it was a unanimous recommendation, I believe, that there should not be, as it was termed, an absolute dwelling defence within the bill. And that was something that was mentioned by legal experts. Many legal experts agreed with that. The police, Scotland agreed with that. The Law Society were very strong on that. The Crown and many others were in agreement with that. So I'm assuming that because that was unanimous, the Conservatives aren't pushing for an absolute dwelling defence. But what they are perhaps suggesting is, can we consider a public element? Now, I would be keen, I mean this in all sincerity and genuineness, I would be very keen to understand what is meant by a public element. So let me just give one hypothetical example, and I'm more than happy, if time allows, to take an intervention on this, or we can discuss post stage 1. That if somebody invited 5 friends to the house, they locked the doors and closed the curtains, so there was no public element whatsoever, and they stirred up hatred against Catholics. And those 5 friends then went out and desecrated chapels and assaulted priests. Now, those 5 individuals would be prosecuted for a variety of different offences. But the instigator, the person who stirred up that hatred, because the doors were closed and the curtains were drawn, is it genuinely the Conservatives' position that that individual should face immunity from the criminal law? Now, they do not need to answer that right now, but I would be keen to understand what they mean by a public element. Could a public element mean that somebody could go into a community hall and only by invitation they could invite people to come, close the doors and stir up hatred, but because there was no public element, it was by invitation only, then they should be immune from prosecution. So I genuinely don't understand what is meant by the public element. So greater clarity from the Conservatives would be most welcome on that point. On freedom of expression clauses, I will just say very briefly, I think, again, members articulated themselves very well in this regard, and the Justice Committee made some important recommendations, which I was pleased to be able to accept and welcome. And I accept Liam MacArthur's interest in this in particular, and happy to work with him in advance of stage 2 to hear his views on how he thinks the government can go further and how the bill can go further. So there is 2 issues. There is the broadening and there is the deepening. So in the deepening aspect, for the freedom of expression provisions that already exist, I'd be very keen to hear from members where they think we might be able to go further. We have gone further on the freedom of expression clause in relation to religion, but can we go further in relation to the freedom of expression clause that exists on sexual orientation? If that is the views of anybody, I would be keen to hear that, and again, keen to engage in that front. On the broadening, on extending or expanding freedom of expression clauses, I have said that we will do that. We will introduce new freedom of expression clauses for transgender identity and for age. I'm not necessarily convinced they're needed on the other protected characteristics, but again, I will keep an open mind. If somebody comes to me and says we need one for potentially disability or variation of sex characteristics, and race and so on. But I don't think they're necessarily needed for the others. On abusive, again, I'll just reiterate what I said in my intervention to the convener. I will give further consideration about providing clarity on the face of the bill. Rick Grant also made this point, James Kelly and others made this point about the definition of abusive. Where my concern is, and I did articulate this in the government's response, where my concern is that we do not, again, fall foul to adverse unintended consequences. So for those areas of the law, threatening or abusive 2010 Act, for example, or indeed any domestic abuse legislation that does not include a definition of abusive, do we through unintended consequences, end up confusing the criminal law in that regard? Because it doesn't have a definition, but this legislation does. Now, that may not be the case. Of course I will.
It's late in the day, and I'm grateful.
Adam Tompkins.
It's late in the day, and I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary, but this is a really important matter. In both the Domestic Abuse Act that this Parliament passed and in the Section 38 offence in the 2010 Act, abusive is objectively defined. It's differently defined in each of those statutes, but abusive is objectively defined in both of those pieces of legislation. Can you answer me this question? What harm would be done by an amendment that simply said that for the purposes of the stirring up offences, abusive means that a reasonable person must have found the behaviour abusive? What harm would be done by that?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, as I say, for me, and I know I'm going up against a law professor here, but the difference in interpretation you and I have is that you consider that to be a definition, whereas actually we consider that to be a different legal test. And actually, that if you introduced a reasonable person test, then that is another legal test. So the threshold becomes threatening or abusive behaviour. That abusive behaviour has to cause fear and alarm, for example. And then the threshold of intended, the behaviour has to be intended or proven to be intended. So I'm not taking it off the table. I do think it's worthy of consideration. I will be talking to internally our legal advisors, as you'd expect, and I would like to come back in advance of stage 2 and have a discussion with the convener about whether or not we can provide clarity to the definition on the face of the bill with adverse negative consequences, and that is a position a commitment I promise to make. I will just end, President Officer, forgive me, I know I'm over time, in saying that I am disappointed in the Conservatives' position. Again, I reiterate that I don't doubt that they are sincere in in tackling prejudice behaviour and discrimination. But I would say I'm disappointed because the government has engaged in good faith. We have found common ground. I would say to the Tories, it would be really, I think, quite important for you to engage, and I'm sure you have done this, but engage further with victims' organisations and those who are the most impacted by hate crime. Because if you're taking the position of voting against the general principles, you are voting against the general principles, not the minutiae of particular provisions or potential amendments that might come forward, but the general principles, and I can see them shaking their head, but that is what you're doing. You're voting against the general principles of a hate crime bill, that is supported by the Equality Network, that is supported by Stonewall Scotland, racial equality groups, many faith groups, Age Scotland, Victim Support Scotland. And on that point, really I will end to say that I've heard many people use the phrase, and their concerns, I know there are genuine concerns, that bills or aspects of the bill could have what is described, quote unquote, as a chilling effect on freedom of speech. And can I just say that we should also be aware, and I'm sure we are, but we should all bear in mind the chilling effect of hate crime. Ask any gay person, any lesbian, any bisexual, any person with a disability, any black, Asian who's been racially abused, any Muslim, any Jew, any Sikh, any Christian, any Catholic, anybody who has been the victim of hate crime, ask them about the chilling effect that hate crime has had on them. And let me just end, I promise, on this quote by Victim Support Scotland, which was in their briefing that was sent to MSPs. And they say that they spoke to a user of their service who's continually physically and verbally threatened in their own community due to both their race and their sexual identity. And that individual said, he's attacking me and my family because of who we are and what we look like. It hurts. I can't change who I am. And that goes to the very root of hate crime. You cannot change who you are. And, Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name and I hope that the Parliament will allow this bill to proceed to stage 2.
Thank you. That concludes our debate on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. The next item is consideration of motion 23531 on a financial resolution for the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. Could I call on Ben McPherson to move this motion?
Formally moved, President.
Thank you very much. The question on the motion will be put at decision time, to which we now turn. So the first question is that motion 23682 in the name of Humza Yousaf on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill at stage 1 be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We're going to move to division. Therefore, we'll suspend for a few moments to allow members to enter to access the voting app. Parliament is suspended for a few moments. Thank you, colleagues. That is broadcasting back on, and we're going to resume proceedings. We're going to go straight to the vote, and the question is that motion 23682 in the name of Humza Yousaf on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill at Stage 1 be agreed, and members may cast their votes now. This will be a 1-minute division. For members online, we're now in the vote. The vote is on motion 23682 in the name of Humza Yousaf on Stage 1 of the Hate Crime and Public Order Bill. Vote yes if you agree with the bill. Thank you, colleagues. I'm afraid we've had a bit of technical difficulty. What happened here was that the members on blue jeans didn't actually hear me calling the vote. And so half a dozen weren't able to exercise the vote. So I'm afraid we'll have to run that vote again. Exactly, no, I know. But I think it's better to run the vote again than disenfranchise members. Okay, so, and I'm afraid we're going to have to wait a second until we make sure that they absolutely can hear the instructions from the chamber. So just a little pause while we hold on, while we find out. And we are not suspended, we are still in session, and we are still being broadcast. Okay, colleagues, there's a slight problem with blue jeans and the members online can't hear instructions from the chamber. So what we're going to do is going to run the vote again. I'm going to type in instructions. They can all see when the vote is open, which is our backup position. We're going to run the vote for slightly longer. We can check whether or not anybody has voted. So we are going to run the vote again. We'll run it for 2 minutes. We'll run it for 2 minutes and we'll make sure that everybody has the chance to vote. Just hold on a second before we get ready to vote. So, colleagues, we're going to vote again. And the question is that motion 23682, in the name of Hamza Youssef, on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill at stage 1 be agreed. Members may cast their votes now. This will be a 2-minute division. 2-minute division on the Hate Crime and Public Order Bill at stage 1. Thank you. That vote is now closed. So I'm going to check whether any members struggle to vote and confirm the vote after that. Point of order, Edward Mountain.
It's finally, the robust system has finally confirmed I voted no, presiding officer. I withdraw my point of order.
Thank you, Mr.
Obviously
Mountain.
not best, but robust.
Thank you, Mr. Mountain. Point of order, Alistair Allen. 1 second, Mr. Allen, your microphone's not on.
I thought I'd voted, but I've got an error message now suggesting that I haven't.
I can confirm that you did vote, Mr. Allen.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Fitzpatrick, point of order. So just wait till the microphone comes on. Mr.
My screen doesn't say whether I voted or not, so I'm hoping I did.
You did vote, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you.
I'm going to call Rona Mackay, who joins us remotely for a point of order. Rona Mackay, point of order.
Rona Mackay, point of order. Rona Mackay, point of order. Rona Mackay, point of order.
Point of order, presiding officer. I was unable to vote and I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Ms Mackay. We heard that. I will make sure that your vote is added to the voting roll. Thank you.
Jenny Mara, point of order.
Presiding officer, I'm sorry I couldn't hear you and I missed the vote. I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Ms Mara. That is noted. Your vote will be added to the voting roll. Thank you. Alec Neil, point of order.
Point of order, presiding officer. Point of order, presiding officer. My system wouldn't allow me in to vote. Microsoft have got no verification codes left. So can I ensure my vote is recorded as...
Thank you. Can I just ensure what your vote was, Mr Neil?
My vote would have been to vote yes.
Thank you, Mr Neil. That has been noted and it will be added to the voter roll, voter register. Sandra White, point of order.
Point of order, presiding officer. I voted yes in the first vote and then was unable to vote in the second. Then they told me I had voted no. Then they told me I had not voted at all. I would have voted and did vote yes.
Thank you, Ms White. I'll make sure that your vote yes is recorded. I can confirm we have now counted for all votes. Thank you. The result of the vote on motion 23682 in the name of Hamza Yousaf is yes 91, no 29. There was one abstention and the motion is therefore agreed. Our next question, our final question in fact, is that motion 23531 in the name of Kate Forbes on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill financial resolution be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We're going to move to division. Members may cast their votes. This will be a 1 minute division. A 1 minute division. That vote is now closed. Thank you, colleagues. I'm afraid there were a few technical difficulties with that vote, so I'm going to take points of order. Thank you, and we'll make sure that everybody's vote is noted.
Hearing it.
A point of order from Rona Mackay, although I'm not sure that the sound is working. Rona Mackay, point of order.
Oh dear.
Yes. Point of order, Rona Mackay. Colleagues, there are a number of technical difficulties. Basically, the members online can't hear us, so although we're in communication, it's not satisfactory. I suggest that we have agreed the main order of business. I suggest that we postpone the financial resolution until tomorrow, and we'll rerun the financial resolution vote tomorrow when we have a chamber. So on that business, on that note, I'm going to conclude decision time, and we will move on to the next item of business, which is a members' debate. In the name of Kenneth Gibson, can I just, before we do, encourage all members to be careful leaving the chamber, wear your masks, observe social distancing, and follow the one-way systems in place around the building. Thank you. And colleagues, before we move to the members' business, I'm actually going to suspend for a few moments just to make sure that the members joining us remotely can join us. So Parliament is suspended for a few moments.